So welcome to this working session for THEC. I do want to welcome Julia Dieter, who has joined us as our student rep from University of Tennessee, Knoxville, studying public policy with a minor in American civics and something else. National security. Yes, that's pretty darn cool. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's good to see you. Well, I guess from there, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Chairwoman Scarlett. I see that Commissioner Rader just joined. Hello. Treasurer Lillard is also joining us virtually. This is a work session. This is a public meeting. Y'all can deliberate. There are no action items on for today. We used to do this on the regular. Look, Mr. Matlock. We used to do this on the regular before our commission meeting would have a work session to be able to talk about things that are on your mind that you can't, of course, talk about privately because we need public meetings that can help guide the staff to where the commission wants the staff to go on certain areas. You'll notice that there are no committee meetings for our commission meeting. We'll go back to having those regularly scheduled at our November commission meeting, but we had prominent legislation passed this past spring that I've talked to you about already. And two things of note that we need to have a discussion about is delegated authority on academic programs. That is a power that the commission has now. And then also tuition ranges, providing for exceptions or multiple ranges for our institutions. Staff are ready to go and think through what that could look like, but we need commission's direction or at the very least questions and conversation to have on those topics. Today, we hope to be here for about 3 hours and then have a break in the middle of it, but just to kick off our shoes, not literally, unless you want to, Charles. Go with that. No, loafer's okay. And have a conversation about, again, academic program approval delegation and tuition, starting off first with academic programs. I'm going to introduce real quick Dr. Brian Prescott and then hand it over to Julie and Katie to help navigate us forward on the academic program approval. The man sitting across from us right here, he's a good friend and colleague. He was here in front of this commission for a retreat a couple of years ago under Bob Smith's leadership as executive director. And yeah, and him and the NCHIMS, which stands for the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, has been a longtime thought partner alongside Tennessee Higher Education Commission. NCHIMS founded in 1969. This is an independent nonprofit that's mission is to use evidence to improve strategic planning for higher education. They've been, like I said, a longtime partner with us under different presidents, Dennis Jones, in the past that used to sit around this table for work sessions as well. We have a contract with NCHIMS right now to think through our next iteration of our tuition model, which has not been updated since the late 2000s. And we thought it was a good timing with this bill that came forward, but also a need to get more information. We initially had him scheduled to come through and talk to you about what he's working on and to get some questions answered by the commission. We also thought it'd be a good opportunity to bring him in as a moderator for the conversation on academic program delegation, as he's got his finger on the pulse of what that looks like across the country. Dr. Prescott, welcome. He received his PhD in higher education from the University of Virginia, has been the president since January 2023 of NCHIMS, has worked at NCHIMS since 2016, and before that in various higher education roles. I'd like to kick it over to Dr. Julie Roberts now to talk about what today's going to look like.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to be really brief. We're really excited to hear from you today. Once the delegated authority was approved, well, we've been working ahead of time, but really kicked it into gear from a staff perspective of doing some research and some other things to prep for today. I wanted to publicly thank Brian and his colleague Louisa for all the prep that they've also done with myself and Katie and team. Do you have some documents in front of you today? You've got a couple of one-pagers. Anyone who knows me well knows a one-pager is never actually one page. So it is front and back, though, one page. And then we also have a pretty substantial report that's a policy scan of other states and academic approval. And I want to thank Amelia Blakely. She knew she was. Amelia's our graduate fellow this summer. She's studying public history at MTSU and really did a wonderful job. We handed this to her and she ran with it. So really many thanks to you, Amelia. I also want to thank Katie and Josh and Megan, who's joining us virtually for all their hard work on this as well. So with that, I'm going to have Katie talk a little bit really high level about some of the things that we are thinking about, and then really want to create as much space and time to hear from you.
Dr. Roberts, before we do that, I'm not sure if Treasurer Lillard heard me earlier because my microphone I don't think was on, but I want to welcome Treasurer Lillard, who's joining us virtually, as well as Commissioner Rader as well. John Rader, thank you. Katie?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I want to reiterate the thanks that Dr. Roberts just shared, both for the facilitation by NCHIMS and also thank our institutional partners for having some candid conversations with us about their thoughts on the program process throughout all of this. I have to say thank you again to Dr. Megan Roberts and Mr. Josh Nave, who hit the ground running in May in his new role here at THEC. I also have to thank Amelia Blakely, who's done a fantastic job with putting together this comprehensive research. And she also facilitated a lot of the state agency interviews that we conducted. I do want to provide a brief overview of what we've done thus far as a programs team, offer two broad observations of what we found in the research and the interview process, and provide a few next steps that we're keeping in mind as we move this forward based on what the conversation is today. So our team reviewed program approval and monitoring policies and procedures in 7 states. They're all listed in the documents we provided to you. And we conducted interviews with staff at state agencies on policies and action in 5 states, including Florida, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, and Texas. Over the past year and a half, we've also had conversations with campus and system partners about policy changes implemented in January 24, and about considerations for future changes from their perspectives. In our policy and research conversations, we noticed 2 things worth mentioning in advance of the conversation today. One is that delegated authority varies widely from state to state and means a variety of things. Another is that policy and practice do not always completely align, or practice proves more nuanced and complicated than a policy may seem on the surface. I believe these 2 observations are reflected both in the one-pager we prepared for today, as well as the longer report. And finally, regardless of how the conversation progresses today, there are some steps that will be necessary in the coming months. Today, we want to hear from you on your future priorities and procedures. After today's conversation, and in partnership with the internal and external stakeholders, we will revise approval policies and procedures with an intention of presenting them for your consideration at the scheduled November meeting. Between now and that time, we'll also be exploring expanded capabilities for shared labor market data sets and considering some of the technological aspects of streamlined approvals. Following consideration of a revised policy, we will work on communicating changes to campuses and provide trainings, support, and transparent information to ensure ease of transition. Our hope would be to have all proposals transition to the new process by the start of the 2026 fiscal year. If not before, recognizing that the proposals we receive often represent months or more of work on the institutional side. We look forward to hearing from you all, and thank you so much for your commitment to our students and to the success of Tennessee's institutions. And so now I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Brian Prescott.
Thanks, everyone. And it's good to be back in front of you. And hopefully I'm not going to inundate you with data slides like I did the last time. I do want to add to what Stephen said about our organization, just to sort of give you a sense of where I'm coming from with these 2 topics. We've been at NCHIMS, most of the work that we've done over the last 9 years I've been there has been under state contracts to address questions like statewide strategic planning for education and post-secondary education in particular, governance and organizational changes in states where there are challenges that we're starting to face around demographic decline that is going to have profound implications for how higher education operates in all the states. We also do a considerable amount of work on state higher education finance and affordability, again, under state contracts. And all 3 of those things has generated in us a real set of focus areas around rural student access and rural institutions in particular, given that some of the pressures that are converging are felt more acutely in some of those settings throughout the nation than they are in institutions that are located in urban areas or in suburban areas. And so as we think about those those things, that sort of frames the conversation, the way in which we wind up talking about both these topics of how to talk about tuition setting authority and also how to think about program review and approval processes. So I'm going to skip the slide about the mission, since Stephen already pretty effectively managed to convey in detail my background and history, as well as our organizational history. So congrats to you on that front. And I'll just jump right into it. So for program review and approval, for these two conversations, my goal here is to not talk at you for too long, but I do want to help set the stage a little bit with what we understand to be going on nationally, insofar as possible. The program review work that was done by your staff was really good, because there isn't a single source on this subject of program review and approval in the way that you might want. Tuition setting authority, there's a little bit more information on that, but I'm going to talk a little bit about where states are generally, and then hopefully, stimulate a conversation with the group here. So first off, in our experience, there's really this question about program review and approval is becoming increasingly tense. Whereas in the past, it was always something that coordinating agencies like THEC and their counterparts in other states had authority to sort of approve and review programs. That process has become increasingly contentious, and there are, I think, two reasons why. One is driven by policymakers and board members, as well as just budgetary realities. There's a sense that we need to prune programs in order to reduce costs or to increase efficiency. So you see legislatures like those in Indiana and in Utah saying we need to cut programs by this certain amount under these kinds of criteria or so forth. That is driving some change around what programs are no longer going to be offered. At the same time, if you think about like the special sauce that institutions have to recruit students, which is really important in a time period of demographic decline, there's really two big sort of ingredients. One is what do they do with institutional financial aid? Well, that'll be part of the conversation we have second around tuition setting. And the other is what programs do they offer? And so you see a lot of increasing tension that's growing as a result of programs being created by institutions that are driven by recruitment goals. And then these are particularly hard for SHIO agencies to navigate, especially for SHIO agencies that have existed as a sort of final check on institutions' growth plans in a period in which growth was pretty easy to assume. They'll put SHIO agencies in a bind around that, because now they are being seen as potential impediments to innovation and to being responsive to local or statewide concerns that the institutions and their lobbying groups can really make, I think, hay with. And you all, as an agency, don't really have a constituency in the same way. So those are the sort of the two big things. And so just some observations around these two things. One is on the left side, the program pruning. It's really highly controversial. It's really important because the alternatives quite often are more triage based. So we need to make cuts. We're going to make across the board cuts. It's not nearly as strategic as saying, for our institution and our constituency, we really need these programs more than these programs. And so we're going to make some choices that way. The reality is that program cuts by themselves rarely generate savings in the short term. They have to be accompanied by cuts of some kind, usually personnel cuts, to actually generate savings. The metrics around which institutions and legislators are thinking about this is often overly simplistic. So, for example, we just finished a project in South Dakota. They had initiated a new process a few years ago to look at programs, and they said, we just want to know the number of graduates and the number of enrollments in each program area. And those programs that fall below a certain threshold are on the chopping block. And we suggested there are some additional metrics that need to be considered because of the ways that programs are deeply interconnected within institutions. If you think about English, for instance, case in point, there's an institution in South Dakota that's graduating less than 5 English majors a year. and yet English as a department is generating the second most credit hours because of the presence of general education. There are other things like that that need to be considered. That doesn't mean that that English department is operating efficiently, but cutting the program isn't going to have much of an impact on the institutional bottom line because of the way in which, in fact, it might have a deeply negative impact if there are actual cuts that are associated with the program cuts. So you have to think about that. So we've also found that program cuts are not necessarily, especially in the short term, as effective as other organizational design changes. So for example, take that English department again, that institution was offering about as many classes at the lower division level and the upper division level. The class sizes on average were about at the institutional average at the lower division level, but very small at the upper division level. And why was that? Because the authority for figuring out what schedule and what to offer was delegated to the department and to the faculty there, rather than having some other mechanism that ensured that there were a certain amount of semester credit hours per faculty member that were going on. So thinking about just how the institution is managing its resources without talking about the program is another way to get at some of these efficiency issues on that side. And then finally, we need to see, we believe at NCHEMS that institutional collaborations to deliver programs and to ensure that losses of services aren't necessarily problematic for other parts of the state is increasingly important. On the program expansion side, a lot of this is legitimate in response to shifting needs. But those expansions are seldom offset by voluntary reductions in programs. And what we'll talk about, I think a good portion of the afternoon today is how do you ensure that those kinds of activities don't generate unproductive competition, lead to mission creep among institutions? How do you ensure that the institutions, which all start at different sort of levels, can compete in the environment for programs at a predictable level? There's an uneven playing field for that. We have seen a lot of questionable modeling on programs. So our enrollment projections on programs as well as institution-wide are often a little bit less rigorous than we might like them to be. And then there's questions about unreasonable duplication. What do we really even mean by that in some cases? It's a term that's used by many, many states, and few of them have really figured out what it means. And speed to market's really important. So when I think about certain kinds of programs, there's probably an abbreviated process than other kinds of programs. So we think about that as well. When we look nationally, this is data from 2019. There is a survey that is, I think, in the field or will be shortly for more recent. But you can see that Tennessee would be in the coordinating board column, and so you see just greater engagement by governing boards, which makes sense. I mean, these are statewide governing boards, right? Not institutional ones for all forms of this academic sort of activity. But program review and approval remain functions that are very significant at both kinds of organizations. And the common elements of them relate to things like quality and those characteristics there. Are we graduating students in programs in ways that they lead to positive outcomes? We have questions about inputs. How aligned are they to both statewide and to institutional strategic plans? And then there are elements of program review that get at the resources necessary there, including employer demand, student demand, general information about costs and revenue. These are all very common among states that engage in this. I would also add, that's not on here, is that some states have sunsetting provisions in their program review, program approval processes. So, for example, you're sort of given you're authorized to offer a program almost on a conditional basis, with some expectation that within the 3 to 5 years you're able to actually show that you've generating graduates and you're on track to have a program that's sustainable. As I shift to the broader question, I want to put in the context of program review in the general concept of institutional mission. And so for this slide, you can look at, there's a lot of words on this slide, but these are actual examples of mission statements in a nearby state And I defy you to tell me which institutions these are. And that is by intent. Mission statements, right, are intended to be inspirational, aspirational. They are a big tent. They rarely have the kind of detailed information in them that allows you to really understand what mission differentiation is. We use that term in higher ed all the time, but the mission statement often is too weak to really provide any guidance on that. And many states, that CO agency is required and authorized to approve mission statements, and in many states, that's what they approve, and it doesn't really have a deeper meaning beyond that. That's not true in Tennessee, and I'll get to that in a second. But what I want to argue is that if you're a state that's really just looking at mission statements, you're getting something that looks a little bit like the thing on the left, which is you've got a set of state goals, you've got a statewide strategic plan that's nested within those state goals, but then you've got the results of all of this incremental program by program approval process that the SHIO agency undertakes. The result is this kind of globby mess, right? You may have programs that are meeting the state goals through the statewide strategic plan, or you may not. So you wind up with a bottom-up exclusively view of what your program array looks like, and the result is your statewide sense of this is just the sum of all of those individual program approval and review decisions. Whereas on the right side, if you're trying to do this intentionally, you have this thing we call at NCHEMS operational missions that sits right in the middle. That sort of is expressing, we as a state are funding you as an institution A and you as an institution B to do something that is maybe overlapping but slightly different. And together we have a sense of how those things that you do meet the statewide strategic plan and the state goals. And your programs collectively exist within that larger conglomeration of operational missions. So when we talk about operational missions, this is the way that we conceptualize mission differentiation. And the ways in which we do that are around programs, at what level are they offered, in what disciplines, and through what delivery modes, and who are they being offered to in terms of, like, sometimes it's a geographic service area, sometimes it's statewide, sometimes it's international, but there's some sense of geography around that. And then there's other characteristics, like this institution is going to serve more older students, this institution is going to drill down on traditional age students, and so forth. And so you have some differentiation around that. And then there are, of course, a whole bunch of other special features that you might want to consider as being important and unique to some institutions and not others. So as I said, Tennessee actually does this pretty well relative to a lot of other states I've seen. So you have institutional mission profiles, and I provided the link there. And you've got code that supports your implementation of those operational missions or institutional mission profiles. I would say just running through them, they are a little bit of a mix. So you've got this code, you create these profiles, and just from my perspective, from an outside space, it's a mix of stuff that you've got. Some of it is unusually and perhaps unnecessarily specific. So some of your institutions come to you every year to have the number of programs they offer identified in their institutional mission profiles. I don't think that's particularly helpful. And in other cases, they're not specific enough around the audience that is really the focus of what they're wanting to do, or in what way they're delivering their educational programs. But it's better than what I see in a lot of states. There's real intent around that. And so I want to congratulate the commission on having at least gotten as far as you have. And and one of the virtues of the role that I play is I get to come in and pick nits at every state I ever go in on something. So at any rate, I want to this is a text heavy slide. I'm not going to go through it all, but there are a whole set of goals for program review and approval. A lot of these on the left already exist and are written into statute in Tennessee. Then there are some on the right that are really kind of to Julie's points about how do we speed the process up so speed to market happens faster, there's a question of like, how do we fill holes in what's being offered that are not really covered by the governing boards, or the governing boards are pushing programs to your consideration through consent agendas, which is not particularly helpful necessarily if they're not doing some serious background work on that. What are the gaps? How do we ensure that the institutions, stuff that comes to you for approval should either be, we really don't know what to do with this, or you've delegated something to Stephen and his team to sort of say, obviously this works. And so there's a set of other goals that you want to be mindful of. And then this slide is going to boggle minds, because it boggled Julie's when I gave it to her. And frankly, it sort of reflects just the degree to which this is complicated, right? I would say that what I'm trying to represent here is that there are at least 3 things that are part of this is for new program review, that are questions that need to be answered. Yes or no? Does the proposed program fit the operational mission? Does it align with the statewide strategic plan? And is there a positive ROI or societal needs? Somebody might come along and say there's some other criteria as well, say we need to make sure that it's got the right kind of institutional cost and structure and business model. I'm not entirely sure that's a part of the conversation for the board, whether or not there's enough capacity on the commission staff to really do that, or is that really the job of the institutions? But anyway, there are these criteria that you want to suggest. Your background materials has some other good ones. On the left side of this slide, I'm suggesting that the way in which these programs will process through an approval process will be different in part based on the level of the kind of degrees. So graduate degrees, you might say, automatically, I'm not saying you should, I'm not here to give recommendations, but you might say that graduate degrees should automatically be reviewed by the commission and should not be delegated to the executive director. And sub-baccalaureate certificates or non-credits, they shouldn't really come up for commission review and approval and be delegated to TBR. Somewhere in between, and minor specializations and concentrations also probably don't deserve a lot of attention by THEC itself. But a lot of these other ones, they need to go through a process where does it fit the operational mission? Does it fit the strategic plan, and so on? And how it processes to whether or not you delegate to the executive director is how we're going to talk about this a little bit. So I would say that, however, that if any of them, including sub-baccalaureate certificates or non-credit stuff, falls outside of the bounds of what the operational mission of the institution is, that's a mission question that is fundamental to what THEC as an organization, as a board, really should be focused on. And so almost any time any one of those things looks like it's going to broaden the institutional mission in a new direction, that requires some kind of commission review. And then the other thing that's important about this slide is that I've got that box on the right side that suggests that as part of new program approval, there's an opportunity the commission has to institute post-approval review. That already happens, and there's quality assurance funding that we can think about and work into this. But for new program approval, there might be a strategy to think about. We need to have some evidence that the program is making progress towards sustainability or towards meeting some kind of needs and so forth as part of the new program approval process. So I've got some questions for discussion. And here I'm going to open it up to conversation, and we can sort of go where the commission wants to. But I'm wondering if you all have, I'm going to start at the top and just ask if you all have any reflections on what the strengths and weaknesses of the current process is, and what kinds of things that you as commissioners would like to suggest to the staff about the kinds of changes that you most likely think are most necessary in academic program review.
I think we'll open it up. I'll just remind everyone to turn your microphone on so that everyone on the screen can hear you.
I'll kick things off. Dr. Prescott, thank you for the presentation. There was a lot in there that I took in, especially given some of the conversations we've had on this commission over the years. We've talked a lot about the lack of innovation by institutions, given the age of technology that we're in, the duplication of programming, the intrusion of government, as well as the accountability of schools. I think when you ask the question about strengths and weaknesses, some of the things that I think have been strengths is it's helped us build a consistency in the state. I do believe, as you talked earlier with regard to the operational, excuse me, the operational mission, I think that's what has helped fuel that operational mission, but I do think we could do better so that THEC is not as intrusive, but also that the schools have the incentive to do what's right by the clientele, if you will, in addition to being profitable. And so I think while there are the strengths, the weaknesses are something that we need to focus on a lot here today. So that's just kind of laying out a little bit of my thought. I'd like to hear more from you at some point, whether it's after we have the questioning or before. What can we do more to drive toward that operational mission that you talked about, and where the schools are operating far more independently, perhaps, as the legislature, I believe, designed it to be, to allow them to do what they know is right for the clientele and do the things that are right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One thing that has driven my interest in this is allowing our universities to be nimble in regard to the workforce needs in particular areas. An example from my area of the state in Upper East Tennessee, I know Eastman Chemical was a major corporation in Upper East Tennessee, was working with ETSU to pursue the creation of a program there that could hopefully quickly generate people qualified to work, at Eastman. And I know the university worked with them to do that. And then 18 months later, this commission approved that program. And with, the labor market we have in Tennessee, with the need for nimbleness in job creation and preparation, I just want to be sure we have a system that when you have a real world workforce need, that we are not bogging down job creation by holding up program creation if the trustees of a certain university deem it, a workable program. Thank you.
Treasurer Lillard?
Yeah, can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I think it's clear that Tennessee has gotten well beyond the issue of trying to regulate or oversee the number of programs in a number of areas at different universities, state universities and community colleges, et cetera, throughout the education system in Tennessee. And a historical example on that is like allied health sciences, where, in 1974, the state went through a grueling debate about whether there should be more than one medical school in Tennessee, and ultimately the East Tennessee State University Medical School was established as a result of that. And we've had other allied health service areas like nursing and pharmacy and other things like that established throughout. So you've got a situation where I think that, we're at a point where it's kind of like what the comptroller was suggesting, that, we focus on particular areas that are of great importance to us. And someone suggested, I think the speaker suggested during his slides, in some of the other states, maybe the THEC body type person approves only PhD programs or something along that line. But I do think that every program needs to be on some kind of consent agenda or other thing that's a fast track deal for approval, because there is always, in a publicly funded environment, the need to make sure that there is some oversight at the end of the day, even if it's quick oversight of what the nature of a particular program is, whether that's objectionable to our General Assembly, to our governor, and to the public of the state. And ultimately, THEC is going to be held responsible as the final approving body for that. It could be that we have as comptroller is suggesting, we have a fast track agenda, for most all of the programs that are not major programs. And also, we've gotten to the point where I'll just comment on one other aspect of that is that the profitability of the program, et cetera, to me, I agree with the comptroller. I think that largely rests with the institution involved about whether it's a program that's profitable to them or breaks even or whatever. I do think there is a need for us to measure that, to have some yardstick to use for that, because there will probably come a day in Tennessee budgeting where we're having cuts that are significant. And, at that point, there needs to be some yardstick to determine, if a program is only graduating 2 people a year or whatever, is it something that is a burden? In other words, to measure the burden on the operating budget of that institution that is comprised probably not only of one program at that institution, but all their multiple programs that, when added together, become material to it in terms of how it's devoting its resources. But as long as the good times roll, I guess it's a matter of the institutions deciding what is important to them.
Any other comments, questions, responses?
So I think that the treasurer raises some really interesting points, and I think that it is the case quite often that the question of whether or not a program is likely to be profitable or at least break even is an institutional level consideration. One of the things I worry about when I see when that's the only thing and then a program is approved and there's no follow-up later is that the profitability of that program sometimes comes at the expense of other institutions' profitability, or it doesn't exist. And now the program it's in the program array of the institution that approved it, or they've got cross subsidies that make it very hard for the institution itself to even know about that, or that there are high demand, high wage programs that actually cost a lot to offer that may or may not be profitable, especially if you want to serve certain kinds of student populations. I'm thinking about nursing programs, for example, that cost a lot to offer. We have a nursing shortage, and one possible avenue is to bring more students that currently can't pay full tuition into the nursing field, but then that program doesn't necessarily break even in the same way. What is the commission's role in thinking about the degree to which it's simply a question of what the institution's accountants are saying about the program versus what the state's needs really are beyond that?
I have I don't know where this question fits in, but I do agree with what the comptroller and the treasurer mentioned as far as time to market. Profitability does make sense, but then I kind of think about TSU, like that was a financial challenge. Challenge is probably not the best word to use, probably there's more accurate ones, but at what point does a commission like that get involved if we recognize that there are degree programs that are not profitable? How does that ladder up to the broader financial well-being of an institution like a TSU example?
That's a great question, and not one that I don't know how you talk about that, because as I understand it, there's not an authority that you've been given to really deal with existing programs. And so I think that's a question that the commission should wrestle with. How does it address how does it address the needs of the institution that where programs are not working? And how would, if the legislature decides, like Indiana or Utah, to suggest cuts, how does the commission get engaged in that conversation without the authority to do that? Which is why I've at least put on the table that there's a meaningful with teeth post-approval review process in terms of new programs, at least, because you do have that authority.
Treasurer Lillard?
Yeah, I would just comment and following up to that comment there that we do need a yardstick, if you will, to measure or set of protocols to measure the profitability or effect on operating impact of operating budget impact of an institution of these low producing programs. And even if we don't have authority to directly do anything about it, we always, in my view, have the authority to comment on it if the commission wishes to do that to the legislature and to those who are in decision-making roles throughout the process, the finance process of the state. And that may becomes very important. I mean, it's been a long time since we've had a situation in 08, 09 where we had serious downturns in state funding. And going back to the day in 08, 09, we were laying off state employees. I just remind everybody that day could return, much as we don't want it to, but it could. And as a result of that, the tools to prioritize expenditures on the institutional level and within an institution need to be provided by entities like THEC, to help make those decisions that decision makers will have to make the hard decisions at that time.
In listening to this conversation, just curious, we were talking about approving programs. Do our institutions ever, rarely, never eliminate any programs? Or are we always just in the adding mode? And it could be that we don't need to eliminate programs, but on the other hand, you begin to look at how things change over time. I would imagine some programs become obsolete, less attractive, duplicative of those who are next door. I mean, I can see where with a nursing program, for example, everyone could probably operate a nursing program very effectively. I'm not sure everyone, I'll pick on philosophers, need a philosophy major effectively. So we'll probably hear some from my philosophy major friends about that, but that's okay. So I'm just curious as how that works.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I haven't looked this year, but we did an analysis of the number of programs that were being added and terminated over the course of an academic year, and it was almost 50-50. So our campuses are actively managing their portfolios actively. I guess I can say that twice. I know Katie manages our academic program inventory. I don't know, did you want to add anything, Katie, or?
Sure, I can. Those are currently processed via the notification policy. So they come to THEC staff. We ensure that they have a teach out plan to accommodate students who are currently enrolled, and then we process the request. We save all of the paperwork that's submitted, and all of this is not the paperwork, obviously, but the actual termination information and timelines are publicly available on our search page. You can run a report in 10 seconds to look and see termination activity and phase out activity, et cetera.
Can I expand on that question? So let's talk about tenured faculty who are associated with those programs and what the real cost driver is to a university. I mean, you establish programs and then you hire faculty who become tenured, and then over time, well, this particular program is phased out, but you really can't phase out that professor in the same way. And so the cost continues, and does that professor move to, another area where they are as valuable as what they're being paid because they have to be retained because of tenure? So let's peel back that onion another layer, and we might change a program, but we don't necessarily change the associated costs.
It's a really good point, and Dr. Prescott mentioned this earlier. A lot of times, terminating programs actually doesn't lead to a big savings for various reasons. There is when this is in the weeds of faculty and tenure, but if a program is terminated, it is possible for a tenured track faculty or tenured faculty member to be terminated. It's not usually practice. I'm looking to Commissioner Smith here to make sure I'm not out of line. So a lot of times faculty could be, to your point, comptroller of getting moved around, or maybe that a key faculty member retires. That could be a reason why a certain area or specialization is terminated. So I don't know if that gets to or Stephen, I think you wanted to.
I'll just put it a little more clearly. If it is a low producing program and that's why the program is being cut, the tenured faculty's position is not necessarily protected. And how an institution works in that regard, that's up to the institution. They might try to reallocate to elsewhere, but that tenure status is no longer protected if it's cut for academic performance. If I can weigh in on the strengths and weaknesses, I'm relatively new in my 12 years stint with THEC to the academic program approval process, really becoming more familiar over the last couple of years with it. To the treasurer's point, I think it's important for the commission to understand the cost of a program coming online, especially if we know that an institution is in dire straits financially. But first and foremost, that is the fiduciary responsibility of the governing board. And if a governing board if everything's looking really good for that governing board, then they should be having that lens on, is it profitable? If it's not profitable, where are we going to pull our resources from? I've been surprised by what's not in the process when it comes to finances, and that is the burden to the state. We don't talk much about what is going to be the financial burden to the state. If an institution wants to bring on a new college in the medical field, for instance, our current process doesn't bring that into attention. This came, and my team knows I bring this up every single week or so. When this body reviewed, did not approve the law school back in 2018, I believe. I was surprised by how little discussion or even data there was talking about what that would mean for the outcomes-based funding formula, how monies would shift when those degrees come on. That's not a level of analysis that we have as part of our process right now. Think about, like I said, a new college for medical facilities. Down the line, is there going to be a new Capitol building that's going to be associated with that new college coming in front of the commission? I feel like that's something that should be reviewed as part of the academic program approval process. The information about the institutional's finances, I think it's good information and something that we should collect, but I see that more the providence of the governing board and what they do. Treasurer Lillard has his hands raised.
Treasurer Lillard?
Yes, I'll just follow up on Dr. Gentile's good comment there, and I agree with everything he said. I think in the case of the Valparaiso Law School and Middle Tennessee State, it was sort of an overwhelming recognition, I think, in the back of my commissioners' minds that the state really didn't need another law program, law school program as a workforce matter or otherwise. And that was a big factor there. So we never really got to the point of even thinking about the good points that Dr. Gentile raises. But I think those points need to be looked at. And again, the commission probably needs to take the role of establishing some type of yardstick to measure the impact on an operating budget of a university, et cetera, of a low performing program, so that can be utilized at a time when it becomes important in terms of allocation of resources when resources are scarce. Because, let's face it, to some degree in higher education today, we have gotten to the point, as I was alluding to earlier, with the medical school and the allied nursing stuff and all that, where everybody who wants one will ultimately have one. You can see that in the private sector with private universities and all that, even in medical schools. And as long as the money's there to support them, then they're going to want to do that because they want enrollment, and they're to some degree chasing enrollment.
So that's That's a very appropriate comment, and I think that one of the things that I say in a lot of settings is, and I probably said it 2 years ago when I was here, is that the higher education industry has had the virtue of not having to change that mindset around growth and enrollment growth as a measure of success for 30-something years, as the number of high school graduates in every state in the country grew over and over and over again. When we talk about program review in that environment, we're talking about how do we allocate new resources. When we're talking about program review and tuition setting and the other kind of conversations that we're in the current environment in lots of states, we're talking about how do we make appropriate decisions about which institutions do what and which institutions don't do other things. That is a very different position for a commission like yours to be in. But it speaks to the treasurer's comment about enrollment growth being sort of the coin of the realm that people are pursuing. That drives prestige, it drives money, it continues to drive everything. And it risks putting the commission in a very, like I said earlier, a tough bind about what they what they can and shouldn't do to sort of set themselves up as a perceived impediment. Let me ask this question, though, number 3 on this list, just directly. What are the circumstances that would require you all to believe you need to weigh in on a program review? Or conversely, what circumstances suggest that you don't want to see it? Like let Stephen do his delegated job. How does the staff know when when they are well within the bounds of what the commission's preferences are to go ahead and approve a program, and what things do you really absolutely need to see in order to bless or not?
In terms of duplication, if there is a program, and I think the law school is a good example, if there's a program that is being proposed, it's already offered within the state by multiple institutions. I'd be curious as to what's the legitimacy of that proposal and what's the viability of that program actually going into.
In some ways, that's really difficult to define. We've had 2 or 3 issues over the last couple of meetings where different members of the commission who have expertise in an area, like law, for example, look at a program and say, we really don't know if this is a viable program or not. And then we had one from my alma mater, the University of Tennessee, that was a master's degree in a program. Of course, you sort of talked a little bit about maybe graduate programs should have approval, but sometimes you don't really know. I think it's very challenging to identify just what would be of concern and what wouldn't be, because as a non-legal authority, Commissioner Perry or Commissioner Lillard or others may look at something and say, wow, I really wonder if we need this or not. And as an educator by training, I may be thinking it's like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. So sometimes those are very difficult to identify.
Treasurer Lillard?
Again, I think we've gotten to the point where in Tennessee, we went from, again, the era when one medical school was what the standard was for the entire state. Now we've got more than one, in the state, and nursing is another example, et cetera. I wonder if we haven't gotten to the point where we should treat as routine just about every request for a bachelor's program or a master's degree program that is not controversial, in the sense that, as I said, at the end of the day, the commission is probably the body the governor and the General Assembly are going to look to if some university somewhere wants to offer a program at whatever level that would be objectionable from some standpoint to the public and to the General Assembly of the state. And that's something that we are going to have to continue to watch and deal with. But, absent that, we've gotten waving away from the point where we used to kind of say, well, look, we already have a program in this grand division in that area, you know, and everything. And now we've gotten to the point where, you know, we've got public universities competing with each other within the same grand division. So that suggests that, to me, that as long as the finances are there, i.e. the institution says they can tote the note on this thing, then, you know, they should be able to do it as long as it's not some type of problematic program from a public policy standpoint.
Go ahead.
Real quick, the Treasurer Lillard, he's brought this up a couple of times. I just want to package it and how we might consider this with delegated approval. The commission is on the hook. You guys are the ones that are appointed by the governor, by the General Assembly. If the program gets through that, you would say the commission should have not approved, but it was delegated. There's an alternative approach to that that could still allow for that speed for approval, and I see this with the Tennessee Board of Regents. I'm an ex officio member of that board, where not everything is waiting for that quarterly meeting. There's a 30-day review that goes out to the board that says this has made it through our rounds. We feel good as staff to delegate and approve this. Commission, look at this if you have any concerns or anything. That's one way to, I think, package that concern and address that in an era of delegated approval.
Well, let me ask go ahead.
Well, just want to touch on, I go back to your target example versus the glob. You know, you had the state goals, the master plan, the missions, and then the programs. If I remember correctly, that was what the target was. I don't know that we have that in a level of specificity that would make me think that just going ahead and automatically approving things right now would make the most sense, because I don't know that it's all aligned. And I think about this from a student's perspective. Ultimately, I believe the goal of completing post-secondary is to get into the job of my choice, whatever that pathway might be, and whatever credential level I attain or choose to attain based on that pathway. Those career pathways are tied directly to, at least in Tennessee, what's that workforce alignment? If the ultimate goal is that we're able to fill the jobs we have of today and tomorrow, or create the jobs tomorrow with the students going through these post-secondary experiences, then to me, a lot of the programs should be tied back to what that is for our state now and into the future. I just don't know that all of that is connected right now. We talk, you know, Treasurer Litter's bringing up nursing. I don't know that we're going to ever not need nurses or people in the medical, given the growth of our entire world, but that's one piece. There's a lot of other industries that I think our state has an opportunity to lean into from an economic development standpoint, but also for businesses that already exist and are trying to fill the jobs. So I don't know that there's a full match there. In addition to that, which I don't think we monitor, is tied to salary outcomes. So what's the degree report? Like, what are the degree outcomes? If a student is going through that program, if it really is aligned to the mission of that institution, it really is aligned to the mission of the master plan and aligned to the state goals, then what are the outcomes for that student? Are they quality credentials? Are they putting students in a pathway where they have a thriving wage, where they don't have to rely on social services? And so I'm missing some of those in that question.
Right.
I would first of all, I would agree with that. And I think the conversation that was mentioned earlier by the comptroller around economic development and workforce, we have a few industry sectors where we know there's massive demand. Medical's been mentioned. I don't think there's necessarily that statewide kind of plan that says these are what we're focused on and what we need. But I think that having something around that would be helpful as we kind of think about how we delegate some of this. I mean, frankly, I'd never need to see a nursing program come in front of this group. I mean, I think, right, you're right. And so if you think about those kind of high demand fields, I do understand the duplication conversation, and it seems to be proven to be a little complicated depending on what sector, what college, what program. But I think balancing that with demand is a big part of this, and making sure we have the data to do it. I like the idea that Dr. Gentile mentioned around maybe there's an opportunity for a review, and if commission feels like we want to talk about it, you kind of pull it off of that and bring it to a full meeting. I think that's an efficient way to be able to move programs through, that still at least gives an opportunity for insight into what's happening.
I want to say I second that as far as what Dr. Gentile said. I think having something in place that maybe allows us to, or allows institutions to expedite, if you will, some of these requests, because it seems like we're hearing this over and over. This has gone on. I feel like we've talked about this for a couple of years, as far as what can we do to not delay that. And so if that's an option, I think that's one that maybe we do need to dive a little deeper into and consider. And I also will say, I do like that we review them. So I'm not really giving a definite answer, but I do like that we review them and having the committees the day before our meeting where we really dive deeper into, for example, access academics and whatever else the name is on the committee. Thank you. Okay. But anyway, where I'm chairing, but and we're going to shorten that, I guess. But I do like that we review those and we dive in a little deeper and talk about each one, because like someone mentioned earlier, when Commissioner Perry mentioned, I think you did, Mike, but when he was talking and asking questions that I didn't even think of, that was his area of expertise. And so it allowed us to really to discuss those a little bit more as commission. So I do like that we review that. Maybe even kind of a side note, if we could talk about some of the programs that have been terminated possibly, or have that. I don't know how lengthy that list would be, but to where we can really have that in front of us and talk about those, because everyone may overlap with something that we're considering at that moment. So that might be helpful, again, for the committee the day before.
I have a question tied to the meeting we had last week, 2 weeks ago. I believe that the governing board of one of the program institutions that we were reviewing, the governing board had their programs in their consent agenda and had passed it. And then it came to us and we didn't have it on a consent agenda. We were asking some pretty pertinent questions. So how does that work within this idea of having either THEC review the programs where the governing boards may or may not have reviewed the programs, and then we're not reviewing it unless we specifically say we want to pull it off the consent agenda? Are we really going to have the oversight necessary? And it could be a process at the governing level. There's opportunity there.
I would think in a world where you would want to, if you want to delegate something, you could put conditions on that. Much like you already have conditions that before an academic program comes to this body, it's got to be reviewed by the governing board. Before the commission delegates a program to the executive director, it's got to be actually reviewed off consent by the governing board. That would be one way of getting that, where you as appointed members have comfort and that other appointed members who are closer to the institution have reviewed those. Those are conditions you can put on that policy.
Yeah, I think that there's an assumed expectation that that's really reflected in some of Commissioner Lillard's comments, that the governing boards themselves are exercising a certain level of oversight over the programs that I think, at least in my experience nationally, can't necessarily be taken for granted. And there needs to be some guidance that comes down from the state that raises questions about, such as what Dr. Gentile suggested, what's the impact on the state funding of this? So it may be that you don't need to answer all of the questions yourself, but there needs to be an expectation that the governing boards have seriously considered and taken up and some of these questions. In other states, there's really active engagement around some of these kinds of questions. And so if the coordinating agency in Maryland, for instance, is reviewing programs that are brought forward by the University of Maryland system, it's they're pretty confident that they can put a lot of those things on the consent agenda because the University of Maryland system has done a deep dive into whether or not those programs are going to be thriving going forward, and that there's a consistent approach to how they estimate and make that judgment.
So maybe this is taking us back too fundamentally, but I think in my mind, and just maybe help me understand this through, our responsibility is over the publicly chartered, if you will, institutions versus the private institutions in the state of Tennessee. Clearly, the public institutions rely a lot more heavily on tax-funded dollars.
Mhm.
So there is some responsibility by THEC under the authority of the General Assembly to ensure that the state's funds are properly managed and handled. Not, again, going back to my comment, not trying to impose intrusive government, but there has to be some sort of responsibility by this board. Otherwise, why are we here? To at least look at it from a macro perspective, recognizing that each institution has its governing body and they function quite well, that the state's best interests are still being applied. So it's a difficult balance in my mind of how do you come to that right setting, if you will, of not being onerous and overly intrusive, but at the same time making sure that the state's funds are well spent.
So completely agree. And I think that my statement is simply that the institutions and their boards shouldn't be able to bypass that very careful review on their own, because there's a thorough and rigorous process that happens at the state level that you all oversee. You all should be able to rely on the rigor of the institution's own processes to understand that, because but in order to do that, I think passing some guidance down to them about how they prepare their stuff, I'm pretty sure that that's probably what's already happening to some degree. But there should be some standard expectations about some of the kinds of business model elements that come forward. So do you even know what competition you are in? How is this duplicated? Is there an alternative to standing up a new program? If you can rely on a program that's being offered by a neighboring institution to deliver to your students because you serve a different audience. Those are questions that are increasingly important for state coordinating agencies to ensure get resolved, but not necessarily is it the case that they need to resolve them themselves. They might choose to, and these are, to the degree that you've got this new the authority to pass to your one employee who wants to be able to retain his job in years ahead. It doesn't want to make a bad judgment because the rules around what's delegated aren't abundantly clear to him. So you need to be, these are if it's a graduate or professional degree program, the commission has to choose. That's not a delegated authority. For example, if it's a certificate level program or there's a lot of non-credit work, you don't want to see that, but we want to make sure that the institutions that are offering those things are able to show that the students participating in them are generating return on investment. And so there's some evidence that they're not fleecing the institutions or the students not the institutions fleece students, but they're serving the students' needs by also serving their own needs as opposed to one or the other. And so I think that there are some elements that you can be clear with the staff about what it is that rises to your level of attention, that comes off the consent agenda, that really needs to be addressed. And to Chair Scarlett's point, sort of, I think she's reiterating my point earlier, but I'll credit her because that's good. Is that really kind of refining what those operational missions, you brought this up earlier, Commissioner Stafford, about what is it that we need to include in them to really give guidance, not just to the staff, but to the institutions about where their lane is. Because I'll give an example in Oregon that I was talking to Russell about earlier. The University of Oregon is an excellent institution, and it can it's a selective institution, but it accepts about 85% of its applicants. And if it goes to 87%, it'll serve those additional 2% of students well. because it has demonstrated that it's got relatively high graduation rates and so forth. But should it also offer, a whole array of non-credit programs? Should it expand its footprint into Portland? Because that's where most of the students are, even though the demographic population decline is pretty significant there. Or are there other state assets that are better positioned to serve some of those students because they can do it at a fraction of the cost of that institution? They're not engaged in research. They're an instruction based institution, but they don't have the brand penetration that the THECs do, right? So what's in the best interests of the state to serve the wide array of student populations with programs that are needed? And I think that's where tuning the operational missions give guidance to the institution. They address the question. I'm curious to know what you all think. What institutions should not do, as much as they address the questions, what should they do in terms of programs? So when I talk about that, that's sort of the answer to the question you posed earlier. It's like, if I'm a particular kind of institution, I need to increasingly lean into that identity to serve the populations of adults that perhaps need better service, to not think about growing my graduate program array just because it might be financially valuable, but think about ways in which I can ensure my students have access to those programs. And just because I can offer everything doesn't mean I should. And so that's I think part of the question that I think is on the table here, that is on the table in a lot of states, and it's not an easy question to answer. I do think, let me just add, that there are a whole array of things that you don't really need to take a close look at on the front end, and you can expedite that process. You can, TBR can handle, some of those activities all by itself without even engaging THEC. But I think there's some value in looking back and seeing whether, what's the impact of those from the state investment point of view and from the outcomes of students' point of view as well.
I like what you say theoretically. Here's the pragmatics that could possibly be in play here. We have, in my judgment, an incredibly qualified staff to help review these programs as they come up. And I think that our staff ask the right questions. It's then incumbent upon the institution to take those questions seriously and to respond to them. And sometimes what gets interpreted as delay is waiting for the institution to respond to the questions that have been legitimately asked. There's then significant pressure put on our staff to move it forward and then let that play out. And that creates an unintended consequence of how this approval is actually going to go down. And there is a presumption in all of this that because it is reviewed at the local board's level, that has rigor in and of itself. And I'm not as confident of that happening as others may feel. And part of that is because the institution's board's mission and their vision is not necessarily the state's. Now, so I want to flip all of this, because that's the cold reality of how we've gotten into some of the messes that have come out. But how culpable are we on our end? Because we are the resource that collects the data, that determines what are the needs within the state, at least in terms of occupational characteristics. We are also the group that establishes and will approve the state educational goals, move that to another body for its review, but then we become the masters of that. Then what is our responsibility to generate advocacy reports around those data about the kinds of programs that we are in need of? Because the way we do it now is we display the data. Then we expect the institution to have an aha moment that might be an area we'd go in. And actually, that works because the institution has far more expertise around these disparate areas than we have. And they have a greater sense of what their own capacity is. But we've been silent in the advocacy for that direction. And then we get the argument from them as to how they've interpreted those data to present a program to us. Maybe we ought to be more forceful in the direction that we say these are the kinds of programs we want to see, and not so dependent upon, did you guess what we were looking for by the volumes and volumes of data that we produce?
Yeah, you're answering my fifth question right there. To what extent should the commission pivot from reactively managing a process that starts at the institution? Right. This is a question we ask in a lot of states, and the answer quite often is, well, we're a state agency. We don't want to be in the position of picking winners and losers. But for example, if you imagine an implication of what you just said is that the commission, either the staff or the group of you, say we need advanced manufacturing in this location, and we want Austin P to deliver it at this level. Bring us a program proposal that responds to that. Then the other institutions are like, wait a minute, we could do that. How come we're not being invited to do that kind of thing? And I think both of those are legitimate questions to be asking. And I think that, again, if those folks who say that it's not the job of the states to pick winners and losers, I would say fair, but it is the job of the state to be clear about what it's buying from these different kinds of institutions. So what does mission differentiation really mean? And when you get clear and crisp about that, then it should be obvious, or at least more obvious, which institutions are in position to meet those needs that all that data and that analysis is generating.
Ryan, I think we have to become bolder in the execution of our mission. There are two factors that are moving as almost a tsunami. One is the so-called demographic cliff. Tennessee is not immune to that. Mm-hmm. We do believe, and I think it is our passion from this commission, that a well-educated workforce is not only desirable, it is a salvation for this state in a competitive economic environment. By the same token, we don't yet know what the reduction in federal support to post-secondary education is really, really going to mean. We already know that it is going to make it more financially difficult for not only undergraduates, but even particularly graduate programs to be populated off of federal subsidies. Yet, most of the programs we've reviewed in the last 6 months are graduate programs. Mm-hmm. Oblivious to, and then of course, in some cases, they didn't even know this was going to happen. But that trend that we've seen just in the last couple of months means that how we manage our finances within post-secondary education is going to be very, very critical. And it happens to be, in my judgment, one of the strengths we have through the quality assurance program and through the commitment we've made to performance funding.
I have a couple of thoughts generating from this conversation so far. First of all, I didn't realize my job was in jeopardy. Until you mentioned that, so let's just not do anything different. But to Commissioner Smith's comment about and drawing to number 5, I have heard directly from institutions, not all institutions, but a desire for THEC to be better prognosticators of what the needs are. I want us to get to a place where we're doing that, perhaps even providing seed funding in the future, should we get that allocation to be able to do so. To the point about, can we trust that governing boards are doing what they need to do? What can we put into place for that? I think there's an opportunity, and it gets to question number 4 up there, and that is, moving that to a trust but verify. We trust institutions and the governing boards are going to do their jobs as fiduciary governing boards and adequately review these programs on these characteristics that we don't think the coordinating body necessarily needs to be a part of. However, there's always a chance, and we saw it with Tennessee State University, where the governing board is probably not looking as closely at some things. The verify part could come across in quality assurance funding. That's been a tool that's been in place here in Tennessee for almost 50 years. How can we better utilize that tool to bring in that verify, where it becomes financially, it's a financial incentive to ensure that those governing boards are doing what they need to be doing with those programs. That's the place that I want to better explore, that we've been exploring with quality assurance funding, is how can we on the back end ensure the quality of these academic programs to allow us on the front end, perhaps streamline the process even further.
I have a couple of thoughts too, based on the kind of conversation that's been going on. Dr. Prescott, I really appreciated a point you made earlier about the kind of the commission's duty to ensure, for lack of a better term, students. I really like the idea of delegated authority and some sort of expedited process in theory, but I struggle with where to draw the line because of the concern that you mentioned. Like in a lot of the materials that we saw, it seems that some of the other states who are dealing with this issue say, well, let's have the coordinating body look at graduate programs and delegate authority for bachelor's degree and maybe non-credential granting programs, but those programs touch far more folks than the graduate programs do. Pick a lane, it ought to be the one that's most impactful. And I wondered too, I also too, Dr. Gentile, I liked your idea about, well, maybe we can do kind of like a 30-day post review. That sounds like it'd be really good for us as the commission. I wonder if for staff it would be make work, like if you'd have to do extra work, and it'd still be fine. Okay.
It was Julie's idea, actually. So.
Okay, good. Because I like that in theory. I'm like, but of course I like it. That'd make things easier for us.
I appreciate the concern, so I hope you're taking notes, Dr. Gentile. But no, we would be happy to facilitate something.
Okay. And I also, the comptroller said something a while back about maybe there could be an emergency docket kind of situation so that we avoid the situation where there's obvious alignment between a professional partner and a university, and then it takes us 2 years to get to a resolution. I wonder, could we take kind of an incremental approach? Like if we implemented some kind of emergency docket situation, could we see how that works and then revisit the delegated authority question? Like if we can address things more quickly that have kind of more urgent needs via this kind of emergency docket mechanism, then maybe the question of delegating authority is not as imminent.
Dr. Roberts, can you speak to, we've gone through this before in the past with the expedited approval process. Can you talk through what have been the strengths and weaknesses of that.
Sure. And we still have an expedited policy on the books. I think a lot of you, I'm pretty open about the fact that since we've made so many changes to our regular process, I think our expedited is actually slower at this point. But we've just been waiting. I know we've been waiting to figure out how to merge these together because we knew with the delegated authority conversation, I think you maybe have a little bit of academic affairs policy fatigue. However, when we first did the expedited program, which has been, I believe, about 4 or 5 years ago, we really did try to think about what pieces we could streamline. We used the process pretty closely aligned though with some of the core components of the approval process. So it cut out some of the paperwork burdens, in my opinion, on the campuses. So we've done this before. I think lessons learned, we could do it much more efficiently. I think the way we've rethought our processes, we've really opened up what it means to review a program, and it was really a different philosophy around holistically looking at a program. I think in the past, a lot of times we were in the weeds of things that weren't as important, maybe really paperworky, technical term. So I don't know if that's getting kind of what you're thinking, Stephen. I think absolutely open to kind of this, like the emergency docket language or a tiered approach, that kind of thing.
An example in my mind would be one of our community colleges in East Tennessee came up recently with a program that involving nuclear engineering technicians. So we need people desperately now to help work on small modular reactors. And that can't wait a year or 2 years. And that's a situation I think instead of a long, lengthy process, it may be that it'd be incumbent upon the commission and staff to say, we're going to get this approved in 30 days, 60 days, whatever the case is, and get going. Other things I think might not be so clear cut. So we heard about a great need for speech therapy assistance, so to speak. But in my mind, while that's really important, that can wait a short period of time. When you need people to work on reactors for national security, that needs to move really fast. So the idea of a docket like that may be something as simple as coming to the staff and saying, this is critically important. We would like to get this on an emergency agenda or whatever the case may be. And then I think it'd be incumbent upon us to move really quickly to get that approved. Other more normal things, I think we could go as fast as we can potentially move and do our diligence, but maybe not quite so critical.
Obviously, we want this to be as efficient as possible and move quickly. I would assume the institutions also want that, but as I understand it, their internal processes can be pretty challenging and lengthy to get through. Should we be asking for reciprocity?
Yes.
Mr. Smith, do you want to add to that or?
No.
Okay.
Well, I know that a couple of years ago, the academic affairs people charted where the proposal was in the process. That is, which side of the net was it on? And I think you would be amazed to know that it spent an inordinate amount of time on the institution side of the net before it came back over the net to the academic affairs staff. And in fairness, that rarely makes it to the ears of the legislature. That's part of the reason that this keeps coming up over and over again. For example, we did review a program in our last session that I know that some of the questions that were asked at this table had been asked and unanswered by the academic affairs staff, and had actually been asked and unanswered by others on the campus, but here we were.
I'll just add, I don't know what, I'm looking at the time, wanting to make sure that we're, okay.
Sorry, just one second. Treasurer Lillard.
Oh, didn't see him. Thanks.
I just wanted to comment just briefly that I've been on the commission for almost 17 years. This next January will be 17 years. Secretary Hargett and I've been on the same amount of time. And over that time, I'm trying to recall in my mind how many programs we have flat out rejected, you know. There's no doubt that I'm sure that we've improved some of them along the way, or the staff has, by its inquiries and its delving into the depths of these programs and all that. But just like the Masters of Legal Studies at MTSU that some people alluded to earlier, that was recently considered by the commission, that one, you know, at the end of the day, it got approved by a 12-0 vote by the commission. And it was an area that, in my mind, there were still substantial questions about whether the graduates of that program will be able to find adequate employment, et cetera, and all the other things. But, you know, and other institutions had the program. UT did, Vanderbilt did, you know, numerous universities around the country did. And so it was kind of like the cat's out of the bag, you know. And so from that standpoint, that's the reason I suggest that one of the things we really need to look at is fast tracking the programs that are truly important, like Comptroller alluded to earlier, workforce situations and all that. And then also concentrate on yardsticks for measuring the burden on the operating expenditures of these universities of any low performing programs that they have after the fact. And that may be something that can be done through committee work and all of that. And one test case to think about this situation to me is, you know, we all know from the unfortunate situations that have occurred throughout the country and even in Tennessee and Nashville and elsewhere about school shootings, about the fact that our mental health network in the state needs some bolstering. And what if we had the Gates Foundation or someone come to Tennessee and say, look, we're willing to fund a laboratory type program, you know, for enhancing a mental health safety net program. And but the problem is you don't have enough clinical psychologists in the state to deal with it, which is a problem in Tennessee right now. If we had 3 of our universities come to us tomorrow and say, we want to establish that program in partnership with the Gates Foundation, how fast could we deal with that? How fast would we want to deal with it, you know, and all of that? Certainly a need of the state. It's not a workforce matter. It's a public safety and health matter. But, you know, it shows again that the types of things that we need to probably concentrate on.
I would just note that there's some of the recent conversation has circled around the question of to what extent is the program review process one that's based on inputs and a priori quality assessments, and one that incorporates estimates of outcomes for students, and also on whether or not the program is actually generating revenue and enrollment sufficient to meet its needs going forward. I think that there's, and I struggle with this as an outsider a little bit, because you know, you've got the post-approval monitoring process. Stephen's talked about the quality assurance funding as a way in. Those are indirect ways to actually get at this, because you lack the authority to actually do the sort of the review and with teeth to sort of get institutions to respond to that. I do think it's worth following along in Stephen's suggestion about the quality assurance funding, because that will create incentives. But it was, again, fine in the olden days to focus on inputs only, in part because the data didn't exist for some of the outputs that you want. But now we don't have that restriction to the same degree. So I think it's useful for states generally to think about how is it that we think about the impact and the effectiveness of program, both from an institutional point of view, from a state point of view, and from a student point of view. Burning Glass did a study 3 or 4 years ago, counted about 10,000 new programs being created in a 5-year period or thereabouts, of which only a quarter or so had produced graduates 5 years later, at least five graduates 5 years later. So there is just a lot of program development that's happening without perhaps proper guidance from the state about what the kinds of things needed, driven by enrollment requirements or revenue requirements or faculty interest independently of any of those kinds of things. And it is unclear whether or not they all work out. And I think that there's a real value in sort of being mindful of those kinds of things with respect to the kinds of resources that states have available now to sort of assess that stuff.
Be interesting to see that Burning Glass data just for Tennessee.
Yeah, I don't know if they broke it down, but I'll track that report down.
Well, I believe, Chairwoman Scarlett leaned over to me and said, I'm not sure if we have a final direction of where we're going here. And I leaned over to her and said, we've got a lot of information that came. We were trying to get from you all what your tastes and preferences were, what your no-goes are, what your concerns are. We're going to huddle up and then reach out to you guys over the next few weeks, a couple of months to test the waters on a direction that we might go. I've heard a lot of talk about logging on to perhaps a 30-day review, a super fast track emergency docket, yardsticks to ensure that institutions are for low producing programs is not financially impeding institutions. I've also heard a desire that we do like to review academic programs, or I'm concerned about essentially consumer protection. And so we'll think more about what that means and come back intermittently over the next few months with some ideas.
Somewhat unrelated, but just to double down on what Commissioner Smith said about the data and providing perspective as opposed to just sharing the information, I think would be really valuable for the state.
Quickly after that, we actually just signed on to a state contract for Jobs EQ to help with just that. So forward to expounding on that later. All right, I think now is time for a break. We slated about 15-minute break, but we're running a little bit behind. If we can be back here by 2:47, we'll go 2:50. I'll round up. We'll talk about tuition after that.
So I think we're gonna head back and
Yep.
start again. I don't know if John Rader or David Lillard are available. We are gonna restart. Dr. Gento.
All right, thank you for that conversation on academic program approval delegation. Another conversation is about tuition, and this gets into both the change that allows for multiple ranges, as discussed at the past commission meeting. Commissioner Rader made a good point that to allow for multiple ranges per institution, that can put us in a dangerous spot, maybe talking more about exceptions to the ranges and what that would look like. But there's also conversation about what data is more helpful to you. We have not updated our model, like I said, in 17 years. There's also conversation about timing. We heard from our institutions that in order to better communicate to their students, can we bring up the binding range to more like March or February? We did that this year. The institutions loved that we did that. At the same time, we bring to you a guiding range in November that's not in statute. It's actually not even in policy. It's a holdover from before we had binding ranges. That helps communicate to institutions where this commission might be going. So we really want to have a conversation about all of that, multiple ranges, data, timing, what the commission needs in order to make good informed conversations. I'm going to take a step away for this for 1 second and just say, tomorrow we reconvene at 9 a.m. There is breakfast. We have a 4:30 tour today of Tennessee State University. If you're able, we'll gather here, and we've got some cars to go over to that. And then 6:30 tonight, Germantown Cafe for dinner. Mr. Van Zomeren, I believe the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, members of the commission. Glad to be here today, joining you to talk about what I think is one of the commission's more potent policy levers, the ability to set maximum increases on tuition for in-state undergraduate tuition and fees. Typically, of course, this was done one range for all of our institutions. Recent legislation expanded this authority to allow the institutions or the commission to set varying ranges by institutions should the circumstances or needs of the respective institution dictate that that was something the commission wanted to do. The conversation I hope that this body can have today, and we have Brian here to help us through this, is to explore, I think, both the philosophical, so what are the things that the commission intends to use this authority to accomplish? What are the goals or intents as we meet each year to talk about this binding maximum increase? How will the commission relate to the institutions and the governing boards who also have authority and purview over tuition setting each year, as well as some of the practical considerations? What data, Dr. Gentile mentioned this, would be most helpful for you? We have the materials that we've put in front of you in years past. Are those things helpful? Are there other things we need to discuss? In what instances would the commission expect to see an expansion of the range for a particular institution, so on and so forth? And then that last piece is on timing and how we'll work through the calendar year. I think we have tried over the last year or two to push that timing up. It's been well received by institutions. It also means, the commission is having to address this conversation with maybe less information than they would have if they took it up in May. So that's something we'll consider as well. I do want to toss it over to Brian in just a second. I'll give one final note on your materials. You have a red line tuition policy in your materials today. Our intent is not, of course, that you'll vote on this at tomorrow's commission meeting. It's really for your reaction. So with that tuition policy that we put in front of you, would do is bring THEC's policy in line with state statute if it were enacted as it's written there today. It's really the bare bones of what the policy would need to be to align it with statute. Throughout our conversation today, I think we can consider if there are other things that the commission would wish to add to the policy. That could be on, setting a minimum number of ranges by differentiated sectors, or Dr. Gentile mentioned that guiding range that's not in policy. Those are things I think we're happy to hear feedback on, and then of course bring to you in November a red line version that we could vote on. With that, I'll toss it over to Dr. Prescott, who will give us a national context and then guide us through some of those questions.
Thank you, Russell. I feel like the utility Swiss Army knife of facilitators today. These are two very different topics. But that's okay. I mean, we're interims. That's what we do. I think it's also useful to note that we are in the process of analyzing a considerable amount of data that's been collected by THEC and from the institutions through THEC around topics of student enrollment, costs of attendance, financial aid distribution, and institutional finances generally, which is going to help us have a better sense of the detailed dynamics, financial dynamics at the institutions in Tennessee. And all of this is to complete a technical analysis and recommendations that we're aiming to bring back to you in November. So I may be seeing many of you again in November. I think that's the plan. And I also need to acknowledge my colleague, Louisa Hunkerstorm, who is on the meeting virtually right now, but she's the one that's done a lot of the work in preparation for that and will be doing that work. So with that as background, I'm sure many of you have seen this sort of iconic diagram that NCHIMS has been peddling for as long as I can remember. But it really illustrates the flow of funds to public higher education institutions. And what it really does is sort of illustrate the dynamics and how complex this is. And I think this isn't going to come to as a surprise to anybody. But what it really helps to imply along the way is that there are a whole array of incentives that are presented to institutions that differ based on the source of the funding that institutions are getting and the rules around which funding flows. And so, for example, Tennessee has been widely acclaimed around the country for its outcomes-based funding model. We've talked a little bit about the quality assurance funding top off that comes with that really drives institutions to be very thoughtful and careful about the way in which they're analyzing their own data to maximize the funding that they get through that outcomes model. Tuition, the level, the amount, and so forth will continue no matter what we do to drive institutions towards growth, but it is mitigated to some degree by the mix of students that you're able to attract, whether they're in-state or out-of-state or graduate students or international students, and the dollars that they are able to bring to the table through federal financial aid or any other source that they might be able to have, including state funding as well. So the state dollars sort of split between going directly to institutions and going through student aid. But as Russell mentioned, the tuition setting authority sort of sets the groundwork for at least how much money institutions are able to advertise for in-state students, what goes on. And so just bear this diagram in mind, especially when you think about how institutions are going to respond to the sort of the whole larger set of incentives that they receive from all of these different ways in which money flows through them, into them, and through them. Here is a sort of a trade-off sort of diagram illustrating sort of the goals that come from establishing a more restrictive, that is a lower maximum level tuition policy versus a more permissive one, particularly since the policy only applies to in-state students, undergraduates. And so on the left side, that's where you limit the amount that institutions are able to raise their tuition. That's going to tend to focus more on student affordability and predictability. It's going to limit the increases of taxpayer funding going through that channel of state financial aid programs, because to the degree that they're linked to tuition levels, particularly Tennessee Reconnect and Promise in the two-year sector. It's a weak but existing attempt to exercise some control over institutional spending, and it will apply more to institutions that are more dependent on state funding than to institutions that are less dependent on state funding. It suggests that institutions can do better if they want by seeking revenue from other sources, particularly out-of-state students, being creative with their fees, and so forth. And then entrepreneurship means like, are we going to figure out how to partner with, yeah. And then it also sort of puts a thumb on the scale for how our messages about affordability in this state are really going to be controlled by the state by saying this is what it costs in terms of published tuition prices. Students will get earlier information about what they think they are going to expect than they would if you, on the other hand, you have a more permissive tuition policy, and then institutions use that flexibility to drive more money to them through institutional financial aid, which isn't necessarily something. Having a daughter about to start college in the fall, I know nothing still about what she's really going to get. My daughter's going to a school on a quarter basis, so that's a little bit later. But anyway, there's a lot of information that is not known by students or their families about what the actual costs are until very late in the game, when it's left up to institutions to do that. The other permissive stuff is that it really helps prioritize institutional goals and their financial sustainability. It limits the amount of taxpayer-funded increases for appropriations that might be required. It creates more flexibility for institutions to manage their enrollment on their own, although to some degree that depends on their ability to do that. So it's not even across all institutions. And then it suggests that institutions can market themselves in comparison to peers or competitors. We did a little bit of research. These next graphs are their data that I'm going to present. They represent information from 22 responses to SHIO's survey on tuition setting policies. And much like the program stuff that we talked about earlier, to really understand this, you got to dig into actually how the practices are working in individual states. And so this question is really about what your policy or your philosophy is for setting tuition in your state. As you can see, most of the states that, only a slight majority of states in the four-year sector have a philosophy driven by institutional level priorities and budgets. None of these things included a majority of states. And so to some degree, this graph reflects the degree to which there isn't a tuition setting policy among states in higher education around the country in a lot of cases. But it also suggests that few states are really expressing a philosophy that incorporates a clear expectation for how the cost burden should be shared between the state and its students. In terms of, an institution increases their funding or their costs by $1, is the state on the hook for 50% of that and the students for 50% of that, or what? There is not a clear sense of that level of specificity in most state tuition setting policy philosophies. There are a few states that do have that expressed somewhere. Virginia, for example, expects about a third of total tuition revenue to come from students, but it's in aggregate, so it's not clear how much of that is going to come from in-state undergraduates, out-of-state undergraduates, graduate students, or whatever. And so there's just a lot of ambiguity in how states really think about this. There's also not a lot of sign that states are, apart from the 2- and 4-year sector difference, that states are thinking about variation in institutional types or missions in their ability to generate revenue, except again at the sector level and through changes in published tuition prices only, nor do they seem to have a clear sense of factoring in how student aid. There are some exceptions to this. So in Tennessee, having some clarity about Promise and Reconnect and the other programs does affect how you all think about tuition setting. In Georgia, Hope, same thing. In Louisiana, there's an ongoing fight over TOPS and tuition revenue and so forth. That being said, there is not a lot of awareness or sightlines into how institutionally funded aid affects institutional bottom lines or addresses affordability. There are a few exceptions there. For example, Texas requires its institutions to set aside a certain amount of funding for tuition revenue that it raises for need-based aid that is offered by the institution. But at any rate, there's a lot of detail around that is not evident in the data that we see around from what states provide about that. Resident tuition setting policy formalized in the state mostly is done by board rule or policy at both 2 and 4 year levels, and also for graduate students. Relatively rarely does the state have statutes on that, or in many cases, there's no formalized tuition rate setting policy for any of those tuition setting levels. In general, it's the institutions or a system level governing and coordinating body that is responsible for setting the actual setting of tuition. I don't know where Tennessee fits in this because I couldn't see the actual data, because it might be the case that the state level coordinating the fourth from the right, because you have binding authority, is responsible for setting at least resident undergraduate tuition rates. But the actual setting of that, where it's going to be, depends on what the individual institutions boards do. So I don't know how you all answered that, but you can see that there's some variation in where this authority lies across the country. And then non-resident state tuition setting policy is formalized in states by, again, most commonly by board rule or policy. These are the kind of questions that come to me when I look at these data. I'm really curious because by legislative statute, it's more common here than it is for resident tuition setting. So you have to really understand how people are answering the questions that Shio's putting out on this. I want to suggest that there's a conceptual framework that might be useful for you as you think about this. NCHIMS has conceptualized affordability for students on the basis of what we call the shared responsibility model. And I've helped states build their state financial aid around how this model actually works in practice. But in general, what it suggests is every student at all income levels has some expectation for coming up with their own contribution linked to minimum wage and what a student can earn working about 20 hours per week or 18 hours per week. Not so much that research suggests that it impedes their ability to focus as a full-time student on their academics. So when you see those students that are full-time students and full-time employees, you can bet that one of those two is suffering as a result of that. But there's research to suggest that around 15 or 20 hours per week of work is not unnecessary or getting too much in the way of their student success initiatives. And so there's this contribution that doesn't matter whether they have no income or they're from a massively wealthy family. In terms of conceptually, you think about a student contribution being equivalent to that level of commitment to earning their own revenue. The family contribution varies from 0 to the rest of it. The cost of attendance is fully covered by the wealthy families in the country. Then there's federal grants and tax cuts, which of course decline as income increases. State grants that do different things depending on the state and its policies. Tennessee's got a mix, and so it's hard. I don't know. I'd have to look at it at the income breakdown. And then importantly, there's these institutional grants and waivers that is often not carefully acknowledged in this. And so when we talk in the fall, in November about the tuition setting policy that you have, one of the things that we're looking into is the extent to which different institutions in your state have different capacities to use that tool to build affordability for the students that they enroll. Then everything else beyond that is unmet need, and that will vary again by income. But it allows for a conceptual framework for what affordability looks like. And tuition is a key component of that cost of attendance piece. And so that's why that's important. I would add that not included in here, but important, is the state subsidy to the institution, right? There's a foundation that's below this whole thing that accounts for the institution's costs of educating those students as well, that the state helps to provide. So with that, sort of as background, I don't have as much to go through. I wanted to just sort of ask, what are the goals, sort of build off what Stephen and Russell said, what are the goals that the commission is trying to advance through tuition policy? And how do you weigh those relative goals that sometimes exist in tension with one another? So student affordability, let's keep tuition low, but that also has an impact on what institutions are able to do in terms of offer student services, improve student success, create new programs, and so forth.
I struggle with this one because to me, it's a challenge. Public institutions, obviously, they have a service to provide to the attendees, whether they're in-state or out of state. And they can only do that with good resources, cost money. And if we're restricting their ability to price their product, if you will, level that they believe is appropriate, then the services are student doesn't really get what they really do. But at the same time, we do want, as a public institution, we want it to be affordable to average or typical students. So that balance to me is one that I grapple with, because I don't know where that should be set. And we had a commissioner on this body several years ago who was not in favor of any increases whatsoever for a number of years. And I can understand the argument there, but that to me wasn't realistic. At the same time, you can't allow, it would be punitive, I think, to allow the institutions to increase their costs without some sort of a limiter so that students can afford to go to a state school, publicly funded. I don't know that I have an answer for this, but I think it is a challenge for this body to figure out exactly where we should settle, if you will, on this topic.
You've encapsulated the major issue at the heart of the matter. You guys you're all unusually quiet so far about this.
Thank you. I like Commissioner Stafford to think about this a lot. As a matter of fact, it's kind of what I thought I was to do as a member of this commission. That was the emphasis that I kind of was told when I was appointed. And because my background is in retail, I tend to look at everything through that prism of, well, the market will tell us, the customer will tell us. And so while I've been on the commission, I've tried to be a good listener to the market and the people who interact in the college of the families, the students. And I'm really hung up over the world of NIL, which is athletics.
Mm-hmm.
We seem to be okay with throwing millions of dollars at great athletes, but we can't seem to find the resources to help a student that needs really to be educated. And I don't have the answer, but I think about that a lot. But I am also fairly well tuned in to individuals who know that I'm on this commission, who would come to me, I think, with comments. And for the most part, they think Tennessee does a good job, or seemingly. Mike, you're in the area I'm in, and we listen to the same constituents, I think, and I don't hear a lot of pushback. And I've been a little bit burned like that, Commissioner, you may have referenced earlier. I was one of those who wanted to keep the tuition rates really low, to
to think the family was needing that help, and that's how we could do so. But I'm not sure we're not doing really a pretty good job overall in managing those costs, Dr. Gentile. I think in most areas, people give us a pretty high mark, seemingly, if comments matter, and I think they do.
I'll kind of tag on us a little bit. I think that from a student's perspective and societally, we're looking at what's the value proposition of post-secondary. And, you know, I think the state over the past, I don't know how many years, has done a really good job of keeping tuition at a decent level. I think there was, I don't know, one year, like there was a large spike in 2000 area-ish. Which if you're a student and you're thinking about planning for the future, if you're so inspired and motivated to go on to post-secondary, if the number one inhibitor to that or barrier to access has to do with money, it's a big piece. And that is a big piece for a lot of families. And so if there's a trust or value proposition challenge, the students don't want to go, I think there's a general hope, this kind of goes back to the programming piece, part of this conversation, is the general hope that the schools, regardless of what institution they are providing the programs that are best suited for the community at large. So whatever community they're servicing. But if there's not that connection for the student, why would they want to go regardless of what that tuition is? So if the tuition keeps going up because the school is producing programs that they think is valuable for the community, but the students don't see the value, how do we create that interest for a student to want to go? I think there's a value proposition piece. And if there's a belief that the tuition has been fine where it is, or from our perspective, is like how we're setting it. I just, kind of what's the pushback or what the difference is?
I love that. I love the framing of like starting from what is the value proposition. I really like that framing. I think I approached this conversation from the perspective of a teacher more than as a lawyer. I taught school before I went to law school, and so I think a lot about the value proposition. Can you go, and if you go, what is your ROI? Like, what can you get out? I think that's a very useful lens through which to view the issue. When I was 17, I thought I wanted to major in finance. Accounting disabused me of that notion. But when I told my dad, who had a chemistry degree, Dad, I think I'm going to major in English. Mom's an English teacher. My dad looked at me and he said, "But what will you eat?"
Exactly.
Well, I'll be a teacher and, lawyer and, but, so I just, I think, I think if my dad were still here with us, he would also say, let's talk about the value proposition. So, I think that's a really good way to look at it. I think kind of my gut reaction would be like Commissioner Matlock's, like never raise tuition, but I think some of the concerns that Commissioner Stafford raised, and certainly hearing from the institutions themselves, it's important. And to some extent, they should be able to price their product at the level fair.
I will apologize in advance because it seems like I harp on this every meeting, but I think we do a really good job of access in Tennessee. If you're a student and you want to have an opportunity to get a higher education degree through Tennessee Promise and through all types of different programs, I think it's available to you. It may be a struggle for some where you have to work some as you go through, but many of us had that experience. And I think most of us would view ourselves as being better for it, not worse from it. So I feel very good about what we are. And I do think we have to keep pushing this idea of return on investment and how it can benefit us, or benefit young people or people going back to school. But I think each of us know folks who didn't go to college and have had wonderful careers and been exceedingly successful and done special things. But in today's world, that's almost become more of a rarity than a commonplace occurrence. So when you look at folks who aren't trying to go back when they're 32, 33 years old and get an education to support their family, I think we should really push hard to tell young people, here's a great opportunity for you in Tennessee, whether it's through our community colleges, our TCATs, or LGIs, or the UT system, or whatever the case, privates, whatever the case may be, that your chances of being successful are certainly going to be much better if you further your education. And with the framework we have set up, it can always be tweaked, but I feel really good about where we are. And it is certainly flattering when we see people from other states coming to see us in Tennessee and tell us about your higher education programs. Because when I was growing up, I wasn't real aware of a whole lot of things that involved higher education, but I was certainly left the impression nobody was coming to see us. And it's like, hey, what are they doing in Tennessee about higher education? Now they are. So I think that's due to some good representation, good leadership throughout our state. Yeah.
Well, I think we do a good job. I think we can always improve. And I do want to see us really talk and discuss, as we do, the tuition range and keeping that lower. Speaking, I guess, as a West Tennessean, I think we always have to look at what our competition is doing. And we lose a lot of students in West Tennessee, unfortunately, to some neighboring states. And it's price driven. It's about that cost there. And I think, the demand is there, obviously, in Tennessee. We have the great sports programs, and everybody wants to come to Tennessee, I think, for our programs, but then also to support those teams, But with that being said, I do think that we have to look at those around us, because we are losing, and know for West Tennessee, some students to some other states, because it is cheaper for them to go there. And we're talking about, in some cases, a state employee whose child is wanting to get a degree in education and goes to a neighboring state. And that just kills my soul. And I talk about that all the time to Dr. Gentile. But I mean, the demand again is there. And a lot of people want to come to Tennessee, and the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Right now, we just cannot outprice ourselves, I guess, if you will, where our students within our state can go somewhere else cheaper. So it's always a concern, and I know it'll be a concern. It will be. We just need to make sure we keep that range, I guess, pretty low, as low as we can.
So I want to ask you, I'm not interrupting anybody, am I? Okay. I have to look at the screen too. How do you operationalize this interest in ROI with the authority you have, which has been expanded, but is still really blunt? I mean, it's just a range that you can set for one portion of the students that are attending your institutions. Like, how do those two things come together? I think you make a good point, but I'm curious if we're constraining our conversation to just the tuition setting authority you have. How do you operationalize that in those deliberations you're going to have in November and throughout the rest of the year to make that happen? It's okay because I don't have an answer to that, and I do this for a living every day. So I'm curious if you're just smarter than me. It's very possible.
No, not smarter than you. But you were talking earlier about the QAF and kind of what opportunities that might help to incentivize quality of programming.
Yep.
And thinking about that from a perspective, if it's such a great high quality program and has a good reputation, build on that, then you would hope that the value proposition would be driven based on reputation and success coming out of those programs for students that have completed it. As far as tuition ranges, if it's a matter of affordability or stackable credentials or transfer pathways, helping students make use of all of the tools that exist here, because I think it's a pretty good deal that a student can go to a 2-year technical school for free in this state. And then a matter of what happens next. I think there's an element of, I think, providing some level of space for institutions to change where they need to. It's a capital market, like they need to be able to have that ability at some level. But past experience has shown that if we open it wide up, some schools are just gonna like, let's go
Right.
double digits. Let's go on out, 20% increase. I don't know how much it actually was, but whatever that number was. And that to me seems, it's not the right thing for our students. I think that would go back to potentially where we would have a place to play.
I haven't been on the commission very long. I would just say over the last year, I've heard from a number of commissioners about the desire to make sure we are managing tuition levels as absolute best we can. And so I think certainly from the first question you've got up there, I think there is a desire to keep things as low as possible. And maybe we've seen something recently where, yeah, we gave a range and immediately one, institution goes straight to the top. And so I think as we think about that, it's everything I've seen from this commission, there's significant attention paid to the impact on the student from a cost standpoint.
I would add though to what Charles said is I agree with that. I think the other goal is to encourage institutions to be, to your earlier slide, more entrepreneurial, to think about how they can, and I said this earlier, be innovative, how they can manage their efficiencies. I don't think schools are being as efficient today as they can be, which is ironic because professors are teaching students how to be the best business leaders in the world. And we're still running institutions as if we were back in the 1950s. And so I don't think institutions have really caught up with how to be more innovative, more holistically, as opposed to just maybe a program or two here and there. And so I think that is one of the goals, is to try to encourage institutions to have more of a innovative entrepreneurial mindset and think about how they can produce good products, raise the revenue that they need, and not always depend on the state to provide the resources. So I see that as the goal, to complementing what Charles said, is again, trying to keep public education as affordable as possible.
Yep.
I think Blue Sky,
Yes.
the Blue Cross Blue Shield.
So you have this new authority to, I think that I'm right? That you can now set multiple different ranges, rather than just one that applies to everybody. How are you gonna think about the goals associated with differentiating that? Like, what are the circumstances that would lead you to say, for example, 4-year institutions can go up to this point, 2-year institutions can go up to this point, or Knoxville, you can go this far, but MTSU or Tennessee State, you can only go this far, or the opposite. How do you think about that, and what information do you need in order to be able to make good judgments about that?
I'm not going to answer that question just yet, because I think there's a dimension that we're not paying as close attention to as we may want to in order to get to a civilized answer to that question. And that is, when we set tuition ranges, there is this kind of illusion that tuition is what makes it affordable. And the reality is, when I dig deep into the weeds of the data about our general fund support, their E&G, and all of those kinds of things, the definition of what becomes part of that formula is not all that clear. And it basically escapes our attempt to deal with the affordability. So for example, and Russell, correct me if I'm wrong here, we say that this is tuition and mandatory fees. And the definition of what is a mandatory fee comes into play here. Because while we think we've established whatever our definition of affordability is, there's ways around that. And institutions are incentivized to find ways around that. Furthermore, we're investing in their education with an expected outcome that feeds the economy, and not all tuition dollars and mandatory fees go to that same goal. So as we look at, conceptualizing, before we can answer the question of conceptualizing affordability, do we really have the leverage that we're looking for the expected outcome that we have set for ourselves here? Because if we don't stop some of these add-on fees and other add-ons, like, for example, you said, and I would love to hear you tell the story in November as to what you said it was your daughter, what the bill is. Because you're absolutely right. It's not until you go to the bursar's office and you look down through this long list and say, what is this? And a lot of that goes right by us. It is when we say this is what we've established and is our answer for affordability, and then it's gamed in order to meet other kinds of needs. And that's kind of a harsh statement, but I think we're deluding ourselves that when we're setting these ranges that we actually have accomplished what we think we're accomplishing.
For clarification of what he's alluding to, we do not have control over non-mandatory fees. Mandatory fees are fees that are charged to all students. That excludes fees that are paid for discipline oriented. If you want to go to take engineering classes, you might have engineering fees paid on top of that. And it spans the disciplines, but there are a lot of those fees that we have no control about. To his point, we squeeze the balloon here and it goes up elsewhere as a possibility.
To the student, it doesn't matter whether it was mandatory or not. They've got the bill for it. And if they want to be in this program in the College of Business, then you're going to pay that on. And that actually, and I'd be surprised if an institution isn't thinking this way, that has become more market driven. Like what will they pay? What are they willing to pay for that? That was not our intent when we set binding tuition rates. I don't think it was.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I may have heard something for the first time today. We set rates, but the school has the discretion to bump, change, adjust on their package. As who controls that? Right.
The boards do.
Non-mandatory fees are controlled by the governing board.
So the governing board is that school's board directors or trustees.
That's correct.
Okay. And they don't answer back to us whatsoever.
Not with regards to the non-mandatory fees.
Okay, so
the commission has no control over non-mandatory fees, out-of-state tuition, graduate student tuition and fees.
Or institutional aid allocations, which you shouldn't.
Right.
Again, as a retailer, if I'm buying a product and that particular vendor adds on for this and this and this and this, I still go to the bottom line and say, what's my cost?
Right. Related to that, we also do not have control over room and board costs, textbook costs, equipment, et cetera. So all of those are after the tuition and mandatory fee.
So the control then is truly the market. at that point. If the family makes a decision whether they go to Memphis or they go to Austin P or they go to UT, but when do they find out this total fee? Is it not till they sign up?
I mean, it depends on the institution when they roll out those costs of those letters, the financial aid letters, but sometimes it'll be as early as possible to ensure that students get enrolled. Depending on other institutions, might be later. Depends on their enrollment management team.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question. Sorry, we're giving you a lot more questions than we're giving you answers, but would it be fair to say then that from a discipline perspective, STEM disciplines probably have the most non-mandatory fees on those?
Yes. I would say in a kind of a broad stroke, yes. And part of that is because the actual instructional costs are higher because of lab equipment, et cetera, et cetera. What we're not asking the institutions to do is to live within that budget and to figure out how to deal with that. It's so much easier to just say, well, we're going to add a course fee for this. And that got started pretty much with what was known as breakage. And breakage was what was expected for the student to break during the course of taking that class. And that's not unreasonable because this would be in an environment in which a lot of glass was being used, like test tubes and micro slides and all of that kind of stuff. Fine and performing arts invariably have fees. From the student's point, to Commissioner Matlock's, they see what's at the bottom line here. You could draw a line on that and say, well, here are the tuition and mandatory fees, which means that every student, regardless of discipline or program, would be paying that. Then here are all the quote non-mandatory fees, except in your mind, it's mandatory to you if you plan to major in this discipline.
That's not uncommon.
No,
Yeah.
in fact,
Yeah.
and it's not unique to Tennessee.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Would it be possible for us to get a list of mandatory or non-mandatory fees from institutions? I would just be curious to see what that looks like. Or would that be so voluminous on a course level that you couldn't make heads or tails out of it?
We can get you that list. We have mandatory fees as part of our annual collection. So you'll see it in your table wrapped up into one number, but it's actually like 20 different mandatory fees. That list we could have to you tomorrow or later today. Non-mandatory fees is not part of the collection because we don't have purview, but we could get one. We'll get one.
That would help us understand a little bit better what's actually out there. And I guess you pay a student activity fee as well? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, is it all right if I go back to the question I did ask you, Commissioner? Because I think you brought up something really vitally important and it gets to the question of that Dr. Gentile asked at the outset about what information do you need?
Well, it wasn't my intent to hijack.
Oh, I know.
The question. It was just that without this additional information, we think we're answering one question and in reality, we're not.
That's right. Yep. I agree. But I do think that it's vital that this body think about this expanded authority to think about differential rates for the piece that you do understand that you have. And I'm curious as to what are the circumstances that would lead the commission to set different rates for different institutions.
I can offer some ideas because you mentioned 2-year sector versus 4-year sector. A potential rationale for having a lower tuition range for community college sector. Tennessee Promise Endowment is running out of money. It's not, by the way. Treasurer Lillard will correct me here, is not running out of money. We're very sufficient with it. But let's say we're in a universe where we could not make the commitment to Tennessee Promise. That might be a reason why we keep that tuition lower. And if we don't see a reason to do that for universities, that might be why it'd be a differentiated tuition
Exactly.
range.
That's exactly a perfect example. Other thoughts?
I like the idea that was floated earlier because of how difficult that question is to answer and completely uncharted water for us. I mean, we're still trying to figure out what is conceptualization of affordability and what is a realistic range in order to address that. So the idea of going ahead and setting those ranges and then letting an institution make a case for a special consideration basically kind of takes us off the hook of deciding in advance what that would be. And then we would give careful and closely scrutinized attention to that case and then make a decision.
Just so we understand, or at least I understand, maybe everybody else got it right away, but you're thinking about, like everybody can go up to 4%, but then exceptions can be.
And then if someone wants to file an exception, then there's a hearing process for the consideration of that exception.
And that would be institution by institution or UTK or the UT system or.
Yeah, I think that in fairness to the integrity of the University of Tennessee system, that they would make the case on behalf of the institution, not the institution.
Yeah. Right, which is why I mentioned that separately.
And then that raises the question, then should we say the same thing about TBR?
Right.
But whatever it is, we ought to be consistent. And honestly, the less we're dealing at the sub-board level, we probably ought to stay out of that. That is where an institution is under some other
board. Yep.
board.
For me, that's a given. But you're contemplating a case where I can't remember how many different boards you've got.
Well,
you would have 8 different possible. You'd set the level in November, maybe even earlier than that, because at this point you're now responding to institutions or boards coming forward with requests for exemptions, but it could be 8 different levels.
Well, not knowing until we'd need to know the state budget.
Sure, fair enough.
So November would be too early.
Okay. But early guidance, I'm saying. At any rate, my main point is you're contemplating a case in which there's potentially 8 different limits that are for each of the boards.
Well,
right?
that's my thought.
Okay.
I honestly believe in practice, it isn't going to happen that often.
Right.
I think how I was hearing it was there's one range potential for exceptions. And yes, those exceptions could lead up to 8 different ranges.
Yeah.
That's
what I meant. So I think then if you open it up that wide, you need some way to assess the cases being brought to you for exceptions. What information do you need for that? Be able to make judgments on that. And how do you do it? Do you is it delegatable to Dr. Gentile and his staff, or do you have to provide those exemptions by vote at your next meeting or something like that? Well, let's talk of the first question. What information do you need in order to fairly judge the cases being brought to you by the boards for those exceptions?
If I may.
I guess Go ahead, Commissioner Rader.
And sorry, I don't have a hand raise option on the Zoom. It was disabled at the beginning, so apologies for interjecting. But I think that this is an incredibly important debate and discussion. I echo Charles's comments earlier about, really guarding against you know, the ease in which tuition increases can continue to go up year over year. And I take, this board had, before it an opportunity to raise a fee earlier this year on at least part of its constituency, which I've voiced heartburn about. And then with the increase in the rate that was agreed up to 6.5% earlier this year, I think we were debating whether to keep it at 3 or keep it at 4 before the vote at the 6.5. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 6 institutions went above 4, and that was certainly not our intent. So, I don't know what the right answer is. I think that if you adopt different ranges for different entities, I think it's a very slippery slope, and I don't know how you guard against the integrity of making sure that everybody's treated fairly. But I just voice all of those points I think is important topics within this broader discussion, which I think is critical. And most importantly, I think we need to judge these entities on how they're doing operationally and how they're trying to save costs. It's not just our job, I think, to guard against the spending part of it, but also, how are you actually creating value by using the taxpayer dollars that you already receive, more effectively, more efficiently, and more value for the students at those levels as well. Thank you.
So as always, Commissioner Rader is ahead of me. My comment and thought is similar to this. I would have loved to have been in the room when the legislature took this up and debated this topic, because it seems to me that when I read what we've got here in terms of maximum allowable tuition and fee increase policies for one or more public institutions, it tells me that we've got to find a way to do that objectively. And that's, to me, very difficult. If you're saying one or more institutions, there's subjectivity in that just by definition. And so I think that causes us potential problem or difficulty in trying to come up with the metrics that would be as objective as possible to really come to set a level that's reasonable and fair across the board and doesn't harm any institutions. I'm struggling with the intent of this.
Yeah, the intent of this has actually come from a number of conversations over the years with a desire. I'd be asked a question by a commission member or sometimes by institutions. Can't we set different ranges? And how we read the statute was no. The reasons why it's come up for potential different ranges, this past year was a clear one. Tennessee State University, who had barely made payroll a couple of times last year, wanting to ensure that they have the funding. And so that's why it went up to 6.5%. Ironically, it wasn't TSU who went up to the top of that range. There has been a couple of opportunities for exceptions when is Tennessee Tech about 7 years ago wanted to reset their tuition to a 15 and 4 program to incentivize on-time completion. We could increase that range to allow for that, but if we did it for everyone, then that would be the reason why it's exception. So it was a tuition policy change there. I think that there's a theme. It's something that is unusual. It's not necessarily the need of looking at the revenue specifically by institution and saying that one needs higher. It's more of that institution should probably declare financial exigency and probably needs a higher tuition range, or that institution over there has found a need to change their tuition policy, perhaps to better serve students, but they can't given the range that we have.
And I think it's incumbent upon us as well to realize there are outside resources. An example, Tennessee Valley Authority has raised electric rates, 3 years in a row? And I would imagine in many of our communities, our universities are the biggest users of that power, or certainly near the top of it. I can assure you, if there were any county commission in this state that raised property taxes 3 years in a row, they would be in dire straits come next election time. But we have, our universities are also subject to many of these outside influences. Sometimes we just think of it as academics, but it's not. And that's just one example. So you start looking at the power, the water, the gas, the sewer bills of some of these institutions, and you're slapping 5+%. And that's just TVA. That doesn't include the locals, what they may be doing to you. That gets out of hand real fast. So, but I just wanted to bring that up to the standpoint of thinking it's not just all academic programs and just faculty salaries. There are a lot of external influences that play into these tuition charges as well.
So I want to ask a direct question, which is that, you know, I want to go back to this crazy thing again. You know, when you look at the student circle in that, the only thing that you control, and even as Commissioner Smith has pointed out, you only have limited control over that, is for the dark blue students in that bucket. And you've got institutions that are, you know, that suggests that you've got 1/3 in-state undergraduates, 1/3 out-of-state undergraduates, and 1/3 graduate students. But that's highly variable across your state and your institutions. That means that the authority that you do exercise for the revenue gathering portion of the non-state revenue gathering portion is variously impactful on the institutions based on the degree to which they enroll in-state undergraduates. Does that worry you in any way? Should that be factored into just as one characteristic of institution that may or may not matter in how you think about this conversation?
I would just say yes, it matters.
How?
We certainly, if I look at Chattanooga, UTC is driven mostly by in-state students and it's almost entirely undergraduate. So they're going to feel the bulk of that pain. Whereas if you're a tier 1 research university like a UTK, it's going to be a different dynamic. You're going to have a lot more graduate students. You're going to have a lot more international students. So it does matter.
Or just, you know, put you on the spot a little bit. Does that suggest that one of those institutions should face a more permissive limit and another a more restrictive one? Or, because I mean, that's going to drive you for Chattanooga, that's going to have a significant impact on their bottom line in ways it won't for UTK.
It could. We'd need the data to really understand the degree of the levers at different institutions, I think, to be able to fully.
I don't think it is our intention in controlling the in-state student tuition to incentivize that the enrollment would be made up by out-of-state students paying the higher amounts. I can make a case for brain gain by going after those students, but there's a tumbling effect, and I think Treasurer Lillard would appreciate this as well. When we build out of those out-of-state students, and then we come because we don't have capital capacity, and we're continuing to grow these, how much are we going to rely on, or how much do we want to rely on the outcome benefits that are coming to the state of Tennessee from having made that decision? Because having sat in that CEO chair, yeah, I'd drive that out-of-state tuition group up. I'd generate those revenues. There's no question. In fact, I did. And I could make the case but I felt obligated to make the case for tracking how many of those stayed as residents in the state and then became taxpayers whose added income contributed back to that investment. But if I became 100% out of state enrolled public institution in Tennessee, what have I said?
Right.
And particularly, just to kind of rub the salt in this, I'm surrounded by counties in which the college going rate is abysmal.
Yep.
I think we ought to be more consciously aware of those data points and how our decisions, as well intended as they are, aren't achieving what we're really setting out to provide for the citizens of Tennessee.
Well, you're kind of going back to the whole mission conversation we had earlier, a little, right?
Absolutely.
So, the kind of information that THEC can provide as background for the decisions that you make, because you're statutorily required to set these rates, will have some additional kinds of things that maybe on the surface don't look like they're directly germane, but you might want to know, where are we getting our student? Because it's a question of mission, and it ties to that. Here's a way to tie these two conversations together. It's it's like, where are you getting your students from? Are they from Tennessee, and from what counties in Tennessee? I mean, your students in West Tennessee, my bet is if I looked at the data, you'd get UTK's getting a lot of students they're getting students from every county in Tennessee, but they're more heavily concentrated on the eastern side of this very wide, narrow state. And so the competition for the students that you're losing might actually be Starkville or something that's actually closer to home than UTK is, 8 hours to the east or whatever it is. So so there's data around where they're coming from. There's data around where the graduates are going. And then, I'll throw in some other data too. But at some point, the institutions have a legitimate beef for the amount of burden you're asking them to provide. So it goes beyond but the data are useful for stuff that's beyond just this tuition setting policy as well. Go back to my questions. So we have just a few more minutes according to my clock, but I mean, you're in charge, except I got to get a plane. So the plane's in charge of me. Yeah. That last question, I want to know if there's an appetite at all around conceptualizing what affordability means. You've actually led the nation in some respects. You're right. People have looked to Tennessee for inspiration for a good number of years now, and congrats to you all for that. But you've been conceptualizing affordability in the two-year sector as free. I shouldn't say but, it's an and. How do you factor in the broader set of funding flows into a broader concept of affordability that accounts for costs of attendance, not just tuition, because of the questions of non-mandatory fees, but also room and board and the rest? And then to what extent do you think, these are two separate questions, but to what extent do you think there's appetite here to sort of say that for some institutions, the burden should be more heavy on the state to provide the support that the institutions need to deliver the services it provides? And how many think that the support should be more on the students? And by students, I don't just mean resident Tennesseans. I mean the whole crowd of students that all contribute tuition revenue to the institution. Is that a fair pair of questions? Well, I mean, one of the ways in which people have come to Tennessee is because you set this Drive to 55 goal and did a fantastic job of orienting a whole array of policies behind it. So more than many other states, you've proven that you can set an aspirational goal and organize around it. So what would suggest that the state couldn't say, we think that the right mix of revenue for the tuition portion of our costs for the state as a whole is 1/3. Or maybe be a little bit less simplistic about it and say, for the 2-year institutions, it's 70% state funded. And for the 4-year institutions, it's 30 or 50%, depending on Tennessee State, maybe it's 50%, UTK maybe. Would that be a helpful guidepost for THEC to work on?
It is, this data point is in the operating budgets that you have for the materials tomorrow. So you'll see from each institution what percent's coming from tuition, what percent's coming from the state. I do think it's a good metric for us to have, to look at. One of the challenges I think we've had with this metric in particular, we've had robust state investment, as I talk about anytime I have a chance to, especially in the last 5-6 years. We've also had some pretty robust tuition growth, especially for those institutions that have access to those out-of-state students or those graduate students. And so that state investment as a percent does not look like it's grown, even though the nominal value has grown pretty dramatically for some of those institutions. You think about the community colleges or some of those regional universities, there we have made up a lot of ground in the last 5 or 6 years, where appropriations is starting to get back to a 50-50 split with tuition.
I would just point out too, though, that one of the things that's worth considering is the case of the private institutions and the extent to which there are translatable lessons to public institutions. So privates are now at what, 52% discount rate nationally, and it's not sustainable. Some of them are in the 90s. So you have places that are raising tuition and losing revenue at the same time. And so that is a case that you can wind up in if you don't have the right information about how the dollars are working out. And it's going to be truer in places that are weaker generally than stronger. But it matters in terms of how you think about what authority you exercise around setting tuition.
I don't know that there's any one metric here, because again, I think about a UTK where like the state appropriations as a percent are relatively small, but they're, by any metric, our healthiest institution because they're pulling in so much money elsewhere. So it really depends on the institution that you're looking at as to what that split would be. I think a healthy metric for us to look at might be sort of a total revenue per FTE, or we also look at net tuition revenue per FTE. This came up, I think, in February with the discounting conversation. When we think about institutions that might need exceptions on tuition or might fall outside of the original range, I think institution that sees that net tuition per FTE tanking is one that we'd have to consider.
We used to have, and we still do, in some assumptions, benchmark what that ratio should be. It kind of went out the window of the Great Recession. So it was 80% state, 20% tuition for TCATs, 2/3 state, 1/3 tuition for community colleges, 55% state, 45% tuition for our universities. We got a long way away from there during the Great Recession. We've clawed our way back, but functionally, those ratios have not served a purpose for our planning and deliberation. Doesn't mean they can't going forward, but functionally, in the last 10 years, they've not. All right. We're getting tight on time here, but Dr. Prescott, I just want to thank you for this really good conversation, and again, getting our juices flowing here to help us think through. But I want to hand it quickly over to Russell, talk through what we've been doing recently, data we've been collecting, and next steps.
Thank you. Just talk through that timeline real quick that I mentioned at the beginning and walk through a hypothetical of how this could work over the next 6 to 9 months. So you can start to really think through, what does this actually mean? Of course, the commission is setting a guiding range in November. I mentioned that there's no obligation to do so. So starting there, of course, the commission could decide to stop setting that range, have that be an information item, or you could enshrine it in policy or continue as you are doing it on an ad hoc basis. In my mind, the setting of that guiding range alongside the appropriation request sort of begins the negotiations between the commission and individual institutions or their boards over the next 3 to 6 months. That is to say, as an example, the commission might say maximum 3% increase alongside this appropriation request. Each of those institutions would have an idea how much of that money should be coming to them. They could then say back to the commission via THEC staff, yes, that would work for our institution, or no, it may not. So if it does not, they would have to fill out or could fill out a special request. We would like to be considered for exemption or an increased range, whatever that might be. In my mind, that would trigger THEC staff to pull additional data beyond what we typically do, basically make some of the cases that you guys are talking about here on behalf of the institution, but also I think a good portion of this would be incumbent on the institution to make the case for why they need an expanded range beyond what others might get. My hope is that all of that information could be brought to the commission in the winter meeting, so February, and voted on at once. That's one option. What that would allow for, let's say 8 of the 8 governing boards have filed for exemption. That might force a conversation where the commission actually decides to move the entirety of the range rather than make 8 exemptions one at a time. Maybe it's one institution, you bring that up as a separate vote from the original range. There's also a possibility here where either the commission or the institutions are not quite ready to make that decision on an exemption in the February meeting, and we would bring it up during the spring, May-ish meeting. Questions or concerns about that timeline?
Work with this daily. What would your recommendation be? What I think I heard from you is that it would be best not to bring it to us to vote on for November. Save it really more for a winter conversation. Is that right?
We typically do a guiding range in November as a heads up to the institutions of where we would land. There's nothing that would preclude you from setting a binding range in November. There's also no reason necessarily to do so. The advantage of waiting until winter for this commission is that we try to strategically follow the governor's budget, the release of the governor's budget. From there, we have a pretty good idea where the finances might end up in any year. So, if the governor's budget is dramatically different from the THEC request, that forces a different conversation than if it matches dollar for dollar.
Kind of stuck on a conversation point, which kind of aligns to this. I'm kind of stuck on the fact that students don't have full transparency of all costs. Is that something that we can gain knowledge of as we're going through this process? Not just everything that you collect, but all the other fees, including houses, so that I feel that to your comment about kind of the retail side, we're not telling the truth if a student shows up. And this goes back to the value proposition, the lack of trust that students have. It's like you show up and suddenly the numbers are very different. I feel like some of that information might help in some of those conversations.
Absolutely, we can. I'll add 2 points there. One, we have a strategic financial plan. My team's been working to update that over the last year or so. That'll come out in the coming months. And one of the things that we talk about in there is more transparency around fees. I don't know that any of this is malintent. Some of it is just, if you're looking for tuition or mandatory fees, that's going to be pretty easy to find on most of our institutions' website. They're statutorily obligated to publish that. For non-mandatory fees, it's so student dependent, and depending on where they are in their academic career, it can be harder for the student to track that information down. But I think THEC could play a role in collecting that data and making it more easily accessible.
And there have been a lot of stabs at this in the last 15 years at the state level and at the federal level. The net price calculator was something that was big back in 2009, and it's still a law that institutions have a net price calculator to be transparent on that. So I think what we'll do is, instead of committing to making it more transparent, we'll do an analysis of what tools are out there and then go from there without having to necessarily burden institutions with yet another way of showing that transparency. Just want to be able to make sure that we take stock of what's out there and that we transform that into information for your purposes.
But to Tara's point, and I agree, we want to give the student as much time to plan, but aren't we somewhat restricted because we don't have we can't set the final ranges until that spring meeting?
So this past year, I'll give a high review of the timing, and I did talk to a couple of presidents yesterday to get their perspective. Institutions start budgeting for next fiscal year. Next fiscal year is fiscal year 27. They start budgeting in October, like for that next fiscal year. They do appreciate getting a glimpse at where this commission might go with the guiding range, which is the purpose of that guiding range, and give them some direction setting and setting that budget. In the past, we've waited for the gavel to fall from the General Assembly and to set that tuition range in May. Heard from the presidents, that's really too long for us to be able to actually communicate to students where things are. So we backed it up to March this past year, which is when we knew where the governor's budget was. We had a good sense of where the finances were for state finances to understand that we're probably not going to get money called back during it. So it was a nice middle period there. And the institutions seemed appreciative of it, and it seemed to work out for us as well. So November, early spring, late winter, and potentially, if there are exceptions needed, maybe coming back another time.
So the earliest a student would.
Yeah.
After the winter commission.
After the winter commission meeting, then the boards come and meets. However, boards come to meet to approve that final tuition, and that had been as late as June this year, but as early as March following our meeting. But they also tend to start communicating to students before the board meets on where they're probably going to go for tuition. It was the uncertainty of where the commission would fall in late May that was a concerning point for them. Yes.
Slightly overcome.
There are, University of Memphis did this. They would lock tuition in for incoming freshmen. They no longer do it, I believe, but it's like a 4-year commitment. That puts a lot on the institution as far as planning purposes go. And I believe that's why University of Memphis is no longer doing it. I'm looking at Renee, the CFO at University of Memphis, but there are some schools that have experimented with locking it in, but things can be uncertain. I think what was uncertain for Memphis was the pandemic. And yeah, no one can predict the pandemic. So
Typically what also happens when they do that is that they jack up the rate for the first year students to some average of what it would be over 4 years. So that first year looks really high. And then if the students wash out, then they've been on the hook for that, that cost. So it's like everything else in higher ed. It's complex and it has trade-offs.
yeah. And Memphis did not do that. Renee is saying they did not do that because our tuition range would not allow for that to happen at that time.
That's from other states then.
I hate to cut this short, but we have the newly non-interim permanent president, Dwayne Tucker, waiting for us at Tennessee State University. Dr. Prescott, thank you so much for flying in today for this. Were we applauding? I'll applaud. Oh, that was paper tearing. I'm applauding for that. Thank you for it. For those who want to go with us to the TSU tour, we'll meet here in 5 minutes to head on over there for that. We've got cars. You can drive over yourself too.